Boy, you got 3 seconds to explain why you're running through my neighborhood at 6 a.m. A hand came flat against his chest, hard enough to break his stride. A badge caught the orange streetlight and threw a slash of reflection across his sweatshirt. Captain Vernon Lusk weighed 240 pounds, carried his service weapon on a tactical hip rig, and believed with absolute certainty that he had just stopped a trespasser. The man he had stopped had been cataloging Precinct 19 for 14 months. Wesley Drayton slowed his breath. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He let the hand stay on his chest and counted the pulse points he could feel through cotton, one in the captain's palm, one in his own sternum, one in the vein running down the side of Lusk's neck where the uniform collar cut in a half-inch too tight. A cruiser idled at the curb with its driver's side door open. Across the street, a sprinkler head clicked to life and began throwing water in a slow metronome arc. Somewhere half a block back, a Ring doorbell camera pulsed red in the pre-dawn dark. "I asked you a question." Lusk's voice came low and even, the kind of low that belonged to men who had learned a long time ago that volume was for amateurs. "I'm on a public sidewalk." Wesley's voice was steady, pitched to carry no challenge. The words were chosen for the Ring camera, for the cruiser dash cam, for whoever dispatched the call that had put Lusk in front of him at 6:02 on a Thursday morning. "Is that right?" Not a question. Lusk's other hand drifted to his belt, thumb hooked against the leather between magazine pouch and cuff case. From the cruiser's radio came the compressed voice of a dispatcher reading a call back for the record. Black male, mid to late 40s, dark hoodie, dark sweatpants, running through the Maplewood Heights subdivision. Caller stated the subject appeared to be casing houses. Caller declined to identify. Call originated from a prepaid cellular device at 5:58 a.m. 5:58. Wesley filed the timestamp. Name: Drayton. First: Wesley. Lusk made a small sound in his throat. Not amusement, something closer to anticipation. "Well, Wesley," he said, drawing the name out like a fisherman pulling slack from a reel, "I'm going to need you to put your hands on the hood of my vehicle. If you think you already know where this is going, you are wrong. Stay with me. What happens to this captain in the next hour will end a career that took him 22 years to build." The hood was warm from the engine. Wesley placed his palms flat, fingers spread, elbows locked the exact degree of a man who had been compliant in this posture before. The captain patted him down with the heel of his hand, not the flat, a distinction that meant something to the people who knew what it meant, and meant nothing to the people who did not. No wallet, no phone, no keys, no... A slim plastic fob on a lanyard tucked beneath the sweatshirt collar, which Lusk pulled out and turned over in his fingers. "What's this?" "Apartment fob." "What apartment?" "2 blocks east." "You don't live in Maplewood Heights." "No." "Then why are you running here?" "Sidewalks are in better shape." Lusk's jaw moved. A small, grinding motion. He did not like the answer. He did not like the steadiness of the voice. He had been a police officer long enough to know that most men stopped on a dark street at 6 a.m., either puffed up or fell apart, and this one was doing neither. "Turn around, slowly." Wesley turned, kept his hands visible, did not look directly at the captain's face, not because he was afraid of it, but because staring would register on the dash cam as aggression, and he had been trained to understand which frames mattered. "You got ID. In my apartment. Convenient. Standard. I don't run with a wallet." A second set of headlights came up the street. The cruiser that rolled in behind Lusk's bore the same unit number format but a different shield. Officer Bryce Kinnear climbed out with a clipboard already in his hand, the way some men carry clipboards, the way other men carry firearms, as a primary tool of control. "Captain. Call came in at 5:58. Suspicious individual. Subject refused to provide documentation." "I didn't refuse. I don't have it on me." "Same thing in the report," Kinnear said, not looking up from the clipboard. Wesley did not respond. He let the silence do the work. Lusk stepped in closer, close enough that Wesley could smell coffee and breath mint and the faint chemical tang of a uniform that had been dry cleaned too many times in the same polyester blend. "Here's what's going to happen, boy." The word landed the way it was meant to land, not as a slip, not as a mistake, but as a flag being planted on a piece of ground the captain had decided was his. Wesley felt the old weight of it, the weight every black man carries in the space between a cop's voice and his own ribs. He did not react. He filed the word. He filed the time. He filed the angle of the dash cam and the position of the Ring doorbell and the second cruiser's body camera status light, which he had already noted was a steady green, meaning the unit was recording and uploading in real time to the department's cloud partition. Real time. That was the word that mattered, because real-time uploads were the one thing that could not be deleted from the server before they hit the Federal Mirror. And the Federal Mirror had been quietly copying Precinct 19's bodycam feed for 6 weeks now, under a court order signed in a sealed chamber by a judge Wesley had personally briefed. Captain Vernon Lusk did not know this. He had just called a black man boy on a public sidewalk at 6:04 a.m. on a Thursday, with his own body cam uploading to a federal server the Department of Justice had been building a pattern or practice case around since the previous October. The lock clicked twice, then silence. 6 weeks earlier, Wesley Drayton had stood in a conference room in the Memphis field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and watched a projected map of Shelby County light up in small red dots. Each dot represented a complaint. Each complaint represented a stop, a search, a booking, a citation, or an arrest in which the complainant had alleged some form of civil rights violation. The map spanned 4 years. The dots were not distributed evenly. They clustered around a single zip code on the northeast side of the city, and within that zip code, they clustered around a single patrol area, and within that patrol area, they clustered around a single watch rotation. The rotation belonged to Precinct 19. The watch commander belonged to Vernon Lusk. 14 months earlier, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had authorized an investigation under Title 34 of the United States Code, Section 12601, the pattern or practice statute that gave the federal government authority to sue a local agency for systemic constitutional violations. The investigation had moved slowly, the way these things moved, through interviews and records requests, and the painfully careful construction of a record that would survive a defense team's motions to dismiss. The record needed ground truth. It needed first-hand observation. It needed an agent embedded in the community who could verify the pattern not from a briefing room, but from the sidewalk. Someone who could experience the stops without triggering the kind of recognition that would spoil the investigation. That assignment had landed on Wesley's desk in a sealed envelope with his name inked on the front in a handwriting he recognized as the assistant director's. He had taken it home, read it twice, signed the authorization in the morning. A month later, a man named Wesley Drayton, freelance urban planner, recently relocated from Atlanta, no public social media presence, unremarkable rental lease on a 1-bedroom 2 blocks east of the Maplewood Heights subdivision, began running the same route every morning at 5:50 a.m. He was 47 years old. He had been an agent for 21 of them. He was the assistant special agent in charge of the Civil Rights Division for the southeastern region of the United States. He had personally supervised 3 consent decree negotiations with municipal police departments, 2 of which had ended in federal monitoring, 1 of which was still ongoing. None of this was visible to Captain Vernon Lusk. What Lusk saw at 6:02 a.m. on the 13th of a Thursday was a black man running through a neighborhood a caller had described as white. What Lusk saw was a trespasser, a suspect, a problem, a boy. What Lusk did not see was the federal court order, the sealed warrant, the wire on a pole 6 houses down that had been quietly recording radio traffic on the precinct's patrol channel for 41 days. The parallel investigation, already at 71 documented incidents, of which this stop was now officially number 72. What Lusk did not see was that he had just walked into the frame. Wesley had been up since 4:45. He had dressed in the dark, not because he needed to, but because the discipline of dressing in the dark had survived his deployments and his decades, and he had never found a reason to give it up. Sweatshirt, sweatpants, running shoes, the same shoes he wore every morning, laced in the same double knot he had learned from a senior agent in 2006. A plastic apartment fob on a lanyard tucked under the collar. No phone, no wallet, no identification. He had left the apartment at 5:50. He had turned east at the corner of Ashwood and Beale Ridge. He had run the same 4-mile loop he ran every weekday, a loop designed by him and approved by his handler for reasons that had nothing to do with cardiovascular health and everything to do with the line-of-sight passes. It offered past 3 addresses the investigation was tracking. He had seen the caller, a man in a robe and slippers standing behind a front window 2 houses down from the 3rd address. The same man had called on Monday, on Tuesday, and on Wednesday. Dispatch had logged those calls and closed them without deploying a unit. Today, they had deployed a unit. Today, they had deployed the captain himself. Wesley had clocked the cruiser at 5:59. He had clocked the second cruiser at 6:03. He had slowed his pace without appearing to slow it. He had arranged his hands and his breath and the angle of his head for the camera, and he had allowed the stop to happen. This was the 72nd documented incident. It was also the first one in which the target was an agent of the federal government. Lusk did not know this. He was not going to know it for 3 more days. And during those 3 days, everything he had built over 22 years was going to come apart in ways he had never imagined were possible. "Hands behind your back." Wesley complied. The cuffs went on. Kinnear tightened them 1 notch past comfortable, which was protocol for aggressive subjects and not protocol for a man standing still in compliance. But Wesley filed the notch and said nothing. "Watch your head." The cruiser's back seat smelled like vinyl and disinfectant and the faint residue of someone who had been sick in the vehicle within the last week. Wesley sat. The door closed. The locks engaged with the double click he had heard 1,000 times in 1,000 jurisdictions. From the front seat, through the divider grate, he could see the dashcam indicator still running green. He could see Kinnear writing on the clipboard with the measured rhythm of a man composing a narrative. He could see Captain Vernon Lusk, framed in the rearview mirror, standing on the sidewalk with his hands on his hips, and the small, satisfied set of his jaw that men get when they believe they have done a correct thing. Wesley let his head rest against the doorframe. He closed his eyes. The work had started. The apartment he rented was a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a brick building that had been built in 1974 and remodeled badly in 2009. It had a galley kitchen, a sliding door that opened onto a concrete balcony overlooking the parking lot, and a bathroom with a pedestal sink that dripped regardless of how tightly the handle was turned. The rent was paid by a shell entity registered in Delaware. The lease had his cover name on it. None of the neighbors had met him because he took the stairs at odd hours, and he did not smoke on the balcony, and he did not play music loud enough to travel through the walls. He had moved in 6 weeks before the stop. He had arrived with 2 suitcases, a foam roller, a set of kitchen knives, and a hard-sided case the size of a briefcase, which lived under the bed on a magnetic tray that registered its removal to a secure phone 3 states away. Inside the case were 2 encrypted laptops, a pair of burner phones, a notebook in which he wrote nothing down, and a satellite radio rigged to monitor the primary and secondary channels of Precinct 19's dispatch. In the first 2 weeks after he arrived, Wesley had been stopped twice on foot. The first time, on a Sunday afternoon, a cruiser had pulled up beside him on Ashwood while he was walking to a small grocery store 4 blocks from the apartment. The officer had leaned across the passenger seat and asked, through the open window, whether he was from around here. Wesley had said he had recently moved in. The officer had asked where he had moved from. Wesley had said, Atlanta. The officer had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Have a good afternoon, sir," and had driven on. The stop had taken less than 40 seconds. Wesley had walked to the grocery store, purchased a gallon of milk, a box of oatmeal, and a small bag of oranges, and had walked home. He had logged the stop in an encrypted note on his burner phone at 3:42 p.m. The second stop, 11 days later, had been different. He had been walking back from the same store, carrying a single bag. 2 officers in a cruiser had pulled to the curb 10 feet ahead of him, blocking his path. Both officers had gotten out. Neither had identified themselves. The younger of the 2 had asked him to produce identification. Wesley had explained that he did not carry identification on short walks in his own neighborhood. The younger officer had asked him to step over to the cruiser. Wesley had done so. The older officer had asked him, in a voice that did not match the social register of the request, whether there was a reason he kept being seen in this area. Wesley had answered that he lived 2 blocks away. The older officer had asked for the address. Wesley had given it. The officer had typed it into the laptop mounted between the seats. The query had returned the lease registration in his cover name. The officer had looked at the screen for a full 7 seconds. Then he had looked up at Wesley. Then he had said, without any change in tone, "We'll be seeing you around." The cruiser had pulled away. Wesley had stood on the sidewalk for another 10 seconds after the cruiser turned the corner. Then he had finished the walk home. He had logged the second stop in the same encrypted note. The older officer in that second stop had been Detective Landon Marsh, though Wesley had not recognized him then, because Carter Voss had changed his face in the intervening decade, in the ways a man changes his face when he has had the time and the reason to. The beard was new, the weight was new, the glasses were new, the posture was new. But the small tilt of the head to the left, when Voss was processing something he had not expected to see, had not changed, and when Wesley reviewed his encrypted note 6 weeks later in a very different context, he would recognize that tilt as the exact tilt he had watched across a courtroom aisle in 2013. In the 3rd and 4th weeks, he had been stopped once more, this time by a cruiser that had pulled alongside him while he was jogging at 6:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. The cruiser had slowed to his pace for approximately 80 yards. The officer driving had not rolled down the window. The officer had simply driven beside him, matching his speed, watching him through the glass. After 80 yards, the cruiser had accelerated and turned off at the next cross street. Wesley had completed his run. He had logged the incident. He had noted the cruiser's unit number. The unit number had belonged to Captain Vernon Lusk. That had been the first time Lusk had personally surveilled him. Wesley had updated his handler that evening. His handler had noted the escalation in the file. They had discussed in a 7-minute call whether to pull Wesley out and substitute a new field agent. They had decided, together, that the pattern being documented was worth the risk of remaining in place. They had agreed on a tactical extraction protocol. They had agreed on a trigger. The trigger had been any physical contact initiated by a precinct officer. That trigger had been crossed at 6:04 a.m. on this morning when Captain Vernon Lusk had placed a hand on Wesley Drayton's chest. The extraction had been authorized in the moment that hand made contact. It had simply been held in reserve on Wesley's own instruction through a pre-agreed signal. The flat palms on the cruiser hood, fingers spread the specific degree of the specific compliance posture that meant do not deploy yet, because Wesley wanted the rest of the record. He wanted the booking. He wanted the planted evidence. He wanted the affidavit. He wanted the cell. He wanted the captain's return to the cell and whatever the captain chose to do in it. He wanted the record complete so that no motion to suppress, no challenge to the warrant, no procedural attack by a defense team could excise the pattern the investigation needed to prove. He had been willing to stay. He had not, however, been willing to stay after the Carter Voss revelation. That changed the calculus. That changed the personal safety equation. That changed, specifically, whether the man running surveillance against him inside the precinct was an actor protected only by his uniform, or an actor protected by a decade-old grudge and a documented willingness to coordinate targeted retaliation. Voss was the second kind. Wesley had already drafted, in his head, the message he would send his handler through the only remaining signal he had. The pattern of his blinks on the cell's ceiling camera, timed to a cipher that his handler had drilled with him for a year before this deployment, and which Wesley had never, in 4 cases, actually needed to use. He had not used it yet. He was waiting to see whether he would need to. He introduced himself to the building manager as an urban planner on a 6-month contract with a regional nonprofit. The manager had not asked which nonprofit. The manager had accepted the first and last month's rent in a single cashier's check and had given Wesley 2 keys and a fob and the address of the nearest laundromat. Wesley had not used the laundromat. He had installed a small stackable washer in the hall closet on his second day. He had washed his own clothes in cold water on a short cycle. He did not trust laundromats. He had learned that in 2011, in a different city, on a different case, in a way he did not think about anymore. The first week, he had walked the neighborhood at different hours and recorded the times. He had mapped the patrol routes by observing, without appearing to observe, which units passed, which corners, at which hours. He had noted the 2 cruisers that idled outside the gas station on Beale Ridge between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., which he understood as a meet point. He had noted the single cruiser that sat with its lights off in the strip mall lot across from a nail salon called Tin Xuan every Tuesday and Thursday between 7 and 9 p.m. The nail salon was on a list. The list had been compiled over a year by the investigation, and the salon appeared on it 9 times. 9 documented complaints of harassment by uniformed officers of Precinct 19. 9 filings with the city's Civilian Review Board. 9 dispositions marked no finding. 9 women, 1 family, 1 small immigrant-owned business on a strip of concrete in northeast Memphis, and 9 uniformed visits that had not once generated an actionable citation. Wesley had not entered the salon. He had walked past it twice. He had made no contact with the owner, whose name appeared in the investigation file as Phan Thi Lien, age 52, immigrated from Vietnam in 1995, proprietor of Tin Xuan Nails since 2008, widow, 1 adult son. The son's name was Dewey. He was 24 years old. He had a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Memphis and a history of posting publicly about his mother's business on a small personal blog which had been flagged, not by the Bureau's investigation, but by a separate intake specialist in the Civil Rights Division who read community complaints and forwarded anything that pattern matched the open file. Wesley had read Dewey's blog posts. He had read them the way one reads a document, with the specific attention of a man looking for usable evidence and useful anger. Dewey wrote well. He wrote angry. He wrote with the clarity of someone who had been educated in systems and was watching the system he had been taught to trust fail his mother in specific, documentable, repeating ways. Wesley had flagged Dewey's name in the file with a note, potential community liaison, approach with caution. He had not yet approached. One of Dewey's blog posts, dated the previous March, had sat in Wesley's case file for the length of a morning run, and Wesley had read it 3 times before closing the tab. The post described, in the same plain registered voice Dewey used for everything he wrote, an incident on a Tuesday evening in February. 2 uniformed officers had entered the salon at 7:15 p.m. The salon had been full, 4 customers in chairs, 2 technicians at the manicure tables, his mother at the front desk with the appointment book open. The officers had asked, in a voice loud enough for every person in the room to hear, whether the owner was present. His mother had said, in English, that she was the owner. One of the officers, a man with a 3-striped chevron on his sleeve, had said, without any attempt at inflection, that he didn't think she understood him. He had repeated the question. His mother had repeated the answer. The officer had then asked, again without any attempt at inflection, whether she was in this country legally. She had been in this country legally for 29 years. She had been a citizen for 21. She had the naturalization certificate framed on the wall behind her, 2 feet from the officer's shoulder. She had said nothing. She had handed him her driver's license. The officer had looked at the license for a long time. He had handed it back without comment. He had then walked the length of the salon, slowly, looking into the back room, looking at the breaker panel, looking at the bathroom, and had come back to the front desk and said, conversationally, that the fire suppression label on the extinguisher by the door appeared to be expired, and that the department would be forwarding a citation through code enforcement within the week. The citation had arrived. It had been dismissed on review. It had cost $216 in filing fees to challenge. No refund of fees had been issued because the original citation had been classified as pre-enforcement notice, which was not technically a citation and therefore did not technically qualify for the fee refund provision of the city's municipal code. Dewey had closed the post with a single line. They did not come back to check on the extinguisher. They came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. 11 Tuesdays, he had written, still counting. Wesley had filed the post in his case materials. He had not reached out. He had not yet needed to. He had, however, made one quiet decision that afternoon, which was that when this investigation closed, whatever form its closure took, the salon at the end of Beale Ridge would not be on anyone's Tuesday evening list anymore. That decision had not been in any briefing document. It was not going to appear in any report. But it was part of the reason Wesley ran the route he ran, at the hour he ran it, past the building he passed. He had, however, approved, through an encrypted channel, 3 weeks before the stop, the placement of Dewey Fan on the Bureau's roster of external technical consultants, at the recommendation of a cyber field agent out of the Nashville office who had worked with Dewey on a separate matter involving a phishing scheme targeting a small bank in Germantown. The consulting agreement was formal. It paid an hourly rate. It required a background check, which Dewey had passed. It did not, however, inform Dewey that the FBI was running a parallel investigation in his own neighborhood. He had been given one narrow, specific assignment: review the public-facing data practices of municipal agencies in a list of jurisdictions, and flag any data handling behaviors that deviated from established federal standards. Dewey had been doing that work for 3 weeks. He had not yet realized that Precinct 19 was one of the jurisdictions on the list, but he was about to. On the morning of the stop, Dewey Fawn woke at 7:20 a.m. in his apartment above his mother's salon, walked downstairs in a t-shirt and sweatpants, and started the coffee maker while checking his phone. His phone showed a news alert on a local Memphis page. Officer-involved incident. Maplewood Heights, 6 a.m., subject in custody, no injuries reported. He would not connect the alert to anything that mattered for another 6 hours. At that moment, he was thinking about the fact that the salon's front window had been marked overnight with a fresh strip of black electrical tape at eye level. The same mark that had appeared every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 weeks running. He did not know what the mark meant. His mother refused to discuss it. He was 24. He was furious in a way he had not yet found the shape of, and he was 3 days away from finding it. In the booking room of Precinct 19, a concrete box lit by fluorescent tubes and smelling of industrial lemon cleaner, Wesley Drayton stood with his fingers spread against a height chart and his eyes forward. The booking officer was a woman in her late 30s with a shoulder patch that read Sergeant C. Pratt and an expression that suggested she had decided what kind of night it was going to be before Wesley had arrived. Name: Wesley Drayton. Address: 427 Ashwood Road, Apartment 2B. Date of birth: he gave it. Place of employment: self. Self what? Self-employed. Urban planning consultant. She typed. The keyboard was sticky. Each keystroke carried the soft resistance of something that had been spilled on and not cleaned. Any identifying marks? None. Any medical conditions we should know about? None. Any medications? None. She looked up from the screen. Her eyes moved across his face the way eyes move when a person is comparing what they see against something they have already decided. You're real calm for somebody getting booked on resisting and trespassing. I'm not resisting. That's what the captain wrote. I'm aware. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the precise adjustment of a muscle that meant something in a station house and nothing anywhere else. Turn to your right. He turned. The camera clicked. He turned again. The camera clicked again. He was walked to a fingerprint station where a younger officer with a chevron on his sleeve took each of his fingers and rolled them, one at a time, across a glass plate that scanned and uploaded directly to the state identification system. That was the part that mattered, because Wesley's fingerprints, once uploaded, would query not just the state database, but the federal one. And when the federal database returned its match, it would do so through a protected channel that would not flag the booking officer's terminal, but would silently notify 3 specific accounts at 3 specific agencies, one of which belonged to his handler. His handler would know within seconds. His handler would do nothing publicly. His handler would take no immediate action. The plan, which Wesley had approved personally and had signed in the assistant director's office, was to allow the booking to proceed, to let the precinct continue its standard process, to permit every subsequent procedural violation to occur and be documented by the precinct's own systems, so that when the federal action came, it would come with a record the defense could not erase. The plan required Wesley to stay in custody for a minimum of 20 hours and a maximum of 72. The plan required him to say nothing. The plan required him to absorb whatever the precinct chose to do to him during that window, within limits, and with a tactical extraction ready to deploy if those limits were breached, and to emerge with a body of evidence large enough to dismantle a department. The plan was going to hold for about 15 hours before it cracked in a direction no one at the Bureau had modeled, because no one at the Bureau had accounted for Dewey Fan. In the back corner of the booking room, leaning against a filing cabinet with his arms crossed, Detective Landon Marsh was watching. He was 41, stocky, bald, wearing a brown blazer over a department polo, and he had the particular posture of a man who had arrived at a place he did not need to be in order to make sure something happened the way he wanted it to happen. Marsh waited until Pratt had finished the fingerprint upload. He waited until Kinnear had delivered the clipboard with the affidavit of probable cause. He waited until the younger officer had stepped out of the room to retrieve a property bag. Then he stepped forward. "Let's do the pockets again," he said, his voice light, almost friendly. "I think we missed one." Wesley watched him in his peripheral vision, said nothing. Marsh reached into the left front pocket of the sweatpants, a pocket that had already been searched twice by Lusk at the scene, and produced between 2 fingers a small, clear plastic bag containing a white crystalline substance. "Well," Marsh said, "would you look at that? That was not in my pocket." "It was in your pocket, sir. I just took it out." "That was not in my pocket." "Pratt, bag this. Field test it. Let's get this on the inventory." Pratt did not move for a moment. She was not stupid. She had been in the room when Lusk had searched the subject on arrival. She had seen the search repeated at intake. She had seen both searches produce nothing. She looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at her. She bagged it. "If you're already feeling what this is going to become, tap that like button and stay with me, because the part that breaks this precinct open hasn't even started yet." Wesley said nothing. He registered the planting. He registered Pratt's half-second hesitation. He registered the specific serial number on the baggie, which Marsh had handled without gloves, which meant Marsh's prints were now on the outside of an evidence bag containing a substance that had not been on Wesley's person at arrest. He registered that the camera in the corner of the booking room was the one Dewey had flagged 3 weeks earlier, as showing an irregular upload signature to the department's cloud partition, a signature consistent with footage being stored not to the primary department archive, but to a secondary, locally hosted server that had been installed off the books 2 years ago and had never been audited. He registered all of it. He said nothing. They walked him to the holding area. They uncuffed him long enough to take the sweatshirt, the sweatpants, and the shoes. They gave him an orange jumpsuit 1 size too small and paper slippers that made a wet slapping sound on the concrete floor. They recuffed him. They walked him to a holding cell at the end of the corridor. Single occupancy, metal bench bolted to the wall, seatless steel toilet in the corner, a single overhead fluorescent tube behind a wire grate that hummed at a frequency 1/2 step above a perfect A. On the walk to the cell, they passed the break room. The door was open. 4 officers sat inside, 3 in uniform, 1 in plain clothes, and Sergeant Corinne Pratt was standing in the center of the room with the Drayton booking file open in her hand. She was reading from it the way a person reads at a dinner party, with the small performative pauses of someone who understands she has an audience. "Self-employed urban planner," she was saying. "Lease at Ashwood and Beale Ridge. No ID on his person, no phone, no wallet. No, runs the same 4-mile loop every morning at 5:50 a.m. That's a lot of discipline for a guy who doesn't know which sidewalk he's allowed on." One of the officers laughed. Another one said something Wesley could not hear as he passed the door. Pratt looked up. She saw him. She did not stop reading. She raised her voice, precisely the half-notch it needed to be raised for the words to carry into the hall. "File says here he's got no priors. Not one. Not a traffic stop. Not a parking ticket. Nothing. You got to work at having a record that clean at his age. Makes a person wonder what he's being so careful about." Kinnear tightened his grip on Wesley's arm and kept walking. He did not look into the break room. He did not need to. Pratt was not performing for Kinnear. She was performing for the file, for the shift supervisor who would read the break room chatter log the next morning, for the precinct's informal record of how a subject had been characterized between booking and arraignment. Pratt had been at the station for 19 years. She knew that stories about a detainee, seated at the right hour among the right audience, had a half-life of their own. By morning, "suspicious loner" would be a thing 3 officers remembered someone else saying first. Wesley filed the name. He filed the words. He filed the configuration of the audience. The cell door closed behind him before Pratt had finished her 3rd sentence. 18 minutes after Lusk's visit to the cell, the door opened a second time. Detective Landon Marsh stepped in. This time, there was no pretext. Marsh did not speak. He walked to the bench where Wesley was seated. He stood close enough that Wesley could see the small chipped patch on the right lens of the detective's reading glasses. Then, in a single motion that Wesley recognized as a procedure the detective had used before, in this cell probably, on other detainees, Marsh reached down, took hold of the cuff chain between Wesley's wrists, and pulled upward. The chain lifted Wesley's arms from his lap. The movement twisted his left shoulder. The cuffs bit into the skin just above the wrist bone, a specific pressure point Marsh knew and Wesley knew. "Stand." Wesley stood. The chain stayed lifted. His arms stayed at an angle that burned within 30 seconds and would be visibly bruised within 6 hours. "You want to tell me now what you're doing in my jurisdiction?" "I'm a freelance urban planner." Marsh pulled the chain upward another half-inch. The burn became something else. "Try again." "I'm a freelance urban planner." 3rd time. "I'm a freelance urban planner." Marsh held the chain for another 2 seconds. Then he let it drop. Wesley's arms fell. The cuffs slid back down to the wrists, leaving 2 parallel marks Wesley already knew would photograph well. Marsh stepped back. His face had not changed once. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 45 seconds. He had left no witnesses, because the camera in the corridor covered the cell door but not the interior, and the cell's own ceiling camera had been, Wesley noted, turned toward the wall at a 30-degree angle from its normal position, not enough to be documented as a malfunction, but enough to remove the metal bench from the frame. Someone had adjusted that camera before Wesley had been put in this cell. That person was either Marsh, or someone who reported to Marsh, or someone who had been told by Marsh which cell to prepare. Marsh left. The door locked. Wesley sat back down. He looked up at the camera. He raised his cuffed hands, very slightly, and held them in front of his chest for a count of 3, long enough that anyone reviewing the footage, later in another building, would see the bruising begin to form at the wrist. He was building the record. He would keep building it until the record was larger than anyone in this precinct could make disappear. The door closed. The lock engaged. Wesley sat on the bench. He placed his hands flat on his knees. He closed his eyes. He began to breathe in the 4-7-8 pattern he had been taught by a field medic in 2004, and he began to catalog everything that had just happened in the booking room, in the order it had happened, with timestamps he estimated to the half-minute. He had been in the cell for 11 minutes when he heard the door unlock again. Captain Vernon Lusk filled the doorway. "Stand up." Wesley did not stand up. "I said stand up, boy." There it was again. The second time in 2 hours. A pattern now, not a slip. Wesley stood. Lusk walked into the cell. He closed the distance to 1 foot. He was a larger man than Wesley, 3 inches taller, 30 pounds heavier. He smelled of the same coffee and the same breath mint. He was, by the regulations of his own department, not permitted to enter a holding cell alone with a detainee who had been processed on the charges Wesley had been processed on. He was doing it anyway. "You think you're funny." "No, sir." "You think you're smart." "No, sir." "You think I don't know what you are." "I'm a man you stopped on a sidewalk, Captain." The open hand strike came from the right. It was not a closed fist. It was the flat of Lusk's palm, delivered across the left cheek with enough force to turn Wesley's head a quarter turn and leave a red print that would be visible on a photograph 4 hours later. The strike was a test. Lusk was checking for reaction. He was checking whether this detainee would flinch, would swing back, would cry out, would freeze. He was checking the subject's category. Wesley did not flinch. He absorbed the strike with the small give of the neck muscles that a trained man gives to a blow he sees coming. He returned his head to center. He looked at the wall behind the captain's left shoulder. He said nothing. Lusk stepped back. Something in his face had changed. It was small. It was the same thing that had been there on the sidewalk when Wesley had answered him too calmly. It was the first flicker, not of recognition, but of the absence of the expected reaction, which in a man like Lusk registered as something wrong. "You're going to be in that cell a long time," Lusk said. "Yes, sir." The captain left. The door locked. Wesley sat back down on the bench. He did not touch his cheek. He did not need to. The heat of the print was doing its own work. He catalogued the strike. He catalogued the words. He catalogued the duration of the captain's presence in the cell, which he estimated at 2 minutes and 15 seconds. He catalogued the hum of the fluorescent. He waited. At 3 p.m., Dewey Fan opened his laptop in the back office of his mother's salon, connected through a VPN tunnel to an encrypted workspace that the FBI had set up for him 3 weeks earlier, and started a scheduled audit of the public data practices of the 4th municipal agency on his list. The agency was the Memphis Police Department. He did not know which precinct. He did know that the audit protocol called for him to pull the daily arrest log, cross-reference the booking timestamps against the department's public-facing incident database, and flag any records where the two did not align within a 5-minute tolerance window. He pulled the log. He ran the cross-reference. 71 records came back flagged. Dewey stared at the screen. 71 flags was not a normal number. 71 flags was the kind of number that made an analyst assume the script was broken. He ran it again, with a tightened tolerance window. 48 records came back flagged. He ran it a third time, with a different comparison field. 64 records came back flagged. The script was not broken. The script was working. The records were wrong. He sat for a long time with his hand on the mouse, not moving it. Then he picked up his phone and sent a short encrypted message to his contact at the Nashville field office. The message said, "I think I found something. I need to talk to whoever is running the Memphis end of this." He did not receive a response for 42 minutes. When he did, the response did not come from Nashville. It came from Memphis. It was 4 words long, and it told him that a senior agent would meet him in person within the hour. Dewey closed the laptop. He went downstairs. He told his mother that he needed to step out. She looked at him over the top of her reading glasses with the particular sharpness a mother reserves for a son who she is certain is not telling her the full truth, and she said only, in Vietnamese, "Be careful," and went back to the appointment book. Dewey walked out into the parking lot. A black sedan with federal plates was already waiting. The woman who got out of the driver's side was in her mid-30s, Asian American, in a dark pantsuit and a discreet earpiece. She showed him a badge. She did not identify herself by name. She said only, "Get in." He got in. The sedan pulled out of the strip mall lot and turned north onto Summer Avenue. Dewey watched his mother's salon shrink in the passenger side mirror. He watched the strip of black electrical tape on the front window move out of focus and disappear. He thought about his father, who had died of a stroke in 2016, in the stockroom of the salon at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday while restocking acetone. His father had lived in this country for 22 years. His father had owned this business. His father had been the first person to explain to Dewey, in careful Vietnamese, that in America there were two kinds of doors, the ones that opened for you and the ones that did not, and that the difference between them was not a thing a person could change by knocking harder. His father had been wrong about that. Dewey had decided, at 18, that his father had been wrong. Dewey had decided that the difference was a thing a person could change, if the person understood how the doors worked underneath. He had gone to the University of Memphis and learned computer science because he wanted to understand the mechanisms of the doors. He had learned the mechanisms. He had been, for the 2 years since his graduation, quietly building a case for himself that his father had been wrong. Now, in the back seat of a federal sedan on a Thursday evening, being driven by a woman whose name he had not been given, Dewey realized that his father had been right and wrong in equal parts. The doors did not open for his mother, and knocking harder had not worked. But somewhere, someone had built a key, and the woman driving this car had just told him that he was going to be the person turning it. The car drove him 9 minutes to a building he did not recognize, in a neighborhood he did recognize, and she walked him through a side door, past a security desk, and into a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a laptop already open to a document he had not been shown before. The document was a pattern or practice investigation summary. It was redacted in the usual places. It was not redacted in the places he needed to read. The jurisdiction under investigation was Precinct 19 of the Memphis Police Department. The lead field agent's name was redacted. But the map on page 4 showed a cluster of incident dots centered on a zip code he recognized, containing a strip of concrete he recognized, and a single building marked with a small yellow circle and a file reference that read TIN-XU-NAIL-22. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at the woman across the table. "My mother is in your file. Your mother is one of 47 complainants. For how long?" 11 months. "And you have known about this?" "We have known about the pattern. We asked you to audit the data practices, Mr. Fan, because your skill set was a match for the technical layer of the investigation. The fact that the jurisdiction in question is also your mother's jurisdiction is a complication the Bureau recognized at the time of your engagement and made a deliberate decision to manage. We needed your audit to be clean. We needed you to flag what you flagged without knowing what you were flagging. You did. That is what we needed." Dewey stared at her. "There is a person in custody," she said, "at Precinct 19, as of this morning, who is central to our investigation. He was arrested at 6:04 a.m. by Captain Vernon Lusk. He has been in custody now for approximately 9 hours. The arresting officers have planted narcotics on him, filed a false affidavit of probable cause, and physically assaulted him in a holding cell. We have reason to believe that the precinct's body cam footage is being selectively uploaded to a secondary server that has not been audited since it was installed." She paused. Her tone did not change. "We need that secondary server's contents." Dewey closed his eyes. He opened them. "You need me to find it. We need you to find it. And when you find it, we need you to recover the files that have been marked for deletion but are still residing in the free space on the drive, before the department's automatic maintenance cycle overwrites them. That cycle runs at midnight. You have 9 hours. Who is in custody? His name, for your purposes, is Wesley Drayton. That's not his real name. That is the name he used at booking. That is the name that matters to you. If I find the server," Dewey said, "what happens to my mother? Your mother becomes the 48th complainant in a federal pattern or practice suit that will be filed within 90 days, and the people who put that tape on her window every Tuesday and Thursday will lose the ability to do it." Dewey did not speak for a full minute. Then he nodded once. "I need access to 3 things," he said, "and I need them in the next 20 minutes. She slid a folder across the table. "Everything you need is on the laptop in front of you. Your clearance has already been adjusted. Your handler is the agent you have been messaging for the last 3 weeks. He knows. You are now operating under a direct assignment from the Memphis field office, reporting to the assistant special agent in charge of the Civil Rights Division. "Who is that?" "You have already met him." Dewey's jaw moved. He understood, slowly, the shape of what he had been told. He did not ask her to confirm it. He opened the laptop, and he started to work. In a holding cell 10 miles away, under a fluorescent tube humming 1/2 step above a perfect A, Wesley Drayton sat on a metal bench with his hands flat on his knees and waited for the midnight cycle he had calculated 2 weeks before his arrest to begin. He did not know that Dewey Fan was now the person racing it. He only knew that someone would be. He only knew that the plan, which had been built on the assumption that he would absorb whatever the precinct chose to do to him during the 20 to 72-hour window, was holding. For now. The cell door opened again at 6:40 p.m. Officer Bryce Kinnear stepped inside, clipboard under his arm, a second officer behind him in the corridor, with a hand resting on the strap of a body camera that was, Wesley noted, not powered on. "On your feet." Wesley stood. "You're being transferred to interview room 2. "On what basis?" "Investigator wants to talk to you." "About what?" "The narcotics we found on your person." "The narcotics that were not on my person." Kinnear's face did not move. He had been at the precinct long enough to have learned not to react to statements like that. He had learned, instead, to write them down. "The narcotics, sir, which are now in our evidence locker, and which a field test has returned a positive for methamphetamine. Combined with the resisting and the trespassing, you're looking at a Schedule 2 possession charge on top of the initial arrest. I'd recommend cooperating." "I'm cooperating." "Then you'll come with me to the interview room." Wesley stepped forward. Kinnear's hand closed on the back of his arm above the elbow, gripping a thick fold of the jumpsuit. The grip was tighter than it needed to be. The grip said something. The grip said that Kinnear was not going to be the physical problem in this precinct, but he was going to be the administrative one, and he was going to be the administrative one with a small personal pleasure at being it. Wesley let the grip stay. He let his body move in the direction it was being directed. He walked the 31 steps from the cell to the interview room, and he counted them, because counting was what his training had taught him to do when there was nothing else available. Interview room 2 was a concrete box with a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on one side, 1 chair on the other, a one-way mirror along the south wall, and a camera in the corner that was, Wesley observed, also not powered on. He noted the camera. He sat in the single chair on the far side of the table. Kinnear cuffed his left wrist to the bolt in the tabletop. Kinnear stepped out. The door closed. Wesley waited. 3 minutes later, the door opened again, and a man he had not yet seen in person walked in, carrying a manila folder and a paper cup of coffee. The man was in his late 50s, silver-haired, mustached, in a brown suit without a tie, with a gold shield clipped to his belt and a nameplate that read, Commander H. Ives. Harlan Ives, Division Commander. The authority skeptic. The man above Lusk. The man whose political donations were on the record. The man whose dismissive response to 31 of the 47 civilian complaints in the investigation file had been, verbatim in 9 of those cases, that the complainant was engaged in activist noise. Wesley had read those 9 responses. Ives sat down across from him. He placed the folder on the table. He placed the coffee next to the folder. He did not offer the coffee. "Mr. Drayton?" "Yes." "I've read the file. I've read the arresting officer's narrative. I've reviewed the evidence inventory. I want to be direct with you. The situation you're in right now, the possession charge specifically, is the kind of charge that does not go away on its own. It does not get dismissed. It does not get reduced. What happens with it depends on what you do in the next hour." "I'm listening." "We have information suggesting you have been cataloging this precinct." Wesley kept his face still. He felt, very briefly, the shift in the room's temperature. "Where did you get that information?" "From an anonymous tip, which came in this morning at 5:45. Wesley did not speak. 5:45. 13 minutes before the 911 call from the prepaid cellular device. 13 minutes was the time it took to place a call to the captain's direct line, brief him on a target, give him a name, and allow him to deploy to a specific block at a specific time. This had not been a random stop. This had not been the escalation of a neighborhood complaint. This had been an operation coordinated between someone inside the department who knew Wesley was coming and someone inside the department who was willing to act on that knowledge. And the commander sitting across from him had just told him, without knowing he had told him, that such a tip existed in the precinct's system. Wesley filed the time. He filed the commander's word choice. He filed the fact that the camera behind him was still not powered on and the fact that Commander Ives had entered the room without a second officer present, which meant this conversation was being held deliberately outside the precinct's documentation protocol. "I don't know what you're referring to, Commander." "Don't you?" "No, sir." "Mr. Drayton, I've been doing this for 32 years. I know the difference between a suspect and a problem. You are a problem. You have been a problem since Captain Lusk put you in a cruiser this morning. Problems, in this precinct, get resolved one of two ways. The easy way, which is that you tell me right now who you are and what you are doing in my jurisdiction, and we find a way to make the possession charge an administrative error. The hard way, which is that you do not tell me, and you spend the next 48 hours discovering exactly how slow a booking process can become when nobody has any reason to speed it up. I'm a freelance urban planner. Mr. Drayton, that is my profession." Ives opened the folder. He turned it to face Wesley. He slid it across the table. Inside the folder was a single printed photograph. It was a photograph of Wesley, taken through a long lens at a distance of perhaps 100 yards, on a sidewalk Wesley recognized as the block that contained his cover apartment. The photograph was time-stamped in the lower right corner. 11 days ago, 6:17 a.m. Someone had been watching him for 11 days. Someone inside this department had been watching him for 11 days. And that someone had, this morning at 5:45, called the captain. Wesley looked at the photograph. He looked up at Ives. He said nothing. Ives closed the folder. "Take your time, Mr. Drayton. You have approximately 7 hours before shift change. After shift change, the officers who will be in this building will be a different set of officers, with a different disposition toward the kind of cooperation I am currently offering. I suggest you think about that carefully." He stood. He picked up his coffee. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Oh," he said. "One more thing. The anonymous tip we received this morning identified you by a name that is not the name on your apartment lease. The name on the tip was Andrew Drayton. I notice you have been going by Wesley. I find that interesting." He left. The door closed. Wesley sat very still. Andrew. That was not a name anyone in this jurisdiction should have known. Andrew was the name on a paper trail that was 11 years old, that belonged to a previous cover identity, that had been formally retired in 2015 and scrubbed from every database the Bureau had control over. Andrew was the name Wesley had used in 2012, in a different city, on a different assignment, when he had been embedded for 16 months inside a federal corruption investigation involving a municipal police department that had, at the end of that investigation, resulted in the indictment of 4 officers and the forced retirement of a deputy chief. One of those officers had pled down and served 6 years. That officer's name was Carter Voss. Carter Voss had been released in 2021, and somewhere in the intervening years, Carter Voss had made his way to a precinct in northeast Memphis, where he had changed his appearance and possibly his name, and had, it now appeared, recognized a face on a sidewalk 11 days ago and begun the process that had ended with a 6 a.m. stop by Captain Vernon Lusk. Wesley had been made. He had been made by a man he had personally put away a decade ago. The plan had just cracked. He sat at the bolted table for a long time after the door closed. He did not touch the folder. He did not touch the coffee. He waited for the heat to bleed out of the conversation and for his own pulse to settle to the rhythm he needed it at. 6 minutes later, the door opened again. It was not Ives returning. It was Sergeant Pratt in a rubber glove, carrying a small paper cup of water in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Welfare check," she said, setting the cup on the table just out of reach of the cuffed wrist. "Department policy." She walked around behind him. She did not uncuff the left wrist. She leaned close enough that he could feel her breath at the side of his neck. A deliberate proximity. A piece of stagecraft he understood was being performed for the same audience her break room reading had been performed for. "You know what I think, Mr. Drayton?" "No." "I think you're exactly the kind of man who comes into a neighborhood that isn't his and convinces himself he belongs there. I think you dress the part. You walk the part. You carry yourself like you've done some research on what the part should look like. And I think you believe that if you just hold still long enough, we'll get tired and let you walk out." She set the clipboard down. She tapped the pen against it twice. "We don't get tired in this building, sir." She walked back around to the front. She reached across the table and picked up the paper cup. She poured the water, slowly, onto the concrete floor between his feet. She watched him watch it. "Looks like the cup was empty," she said. "Must be a supply issue." She dropped the cup into the small metal trash can by the door. She picked up the clipboard. "Refused water at 10:04 p.m., she said, noting it on the form. "Subject, non-cooperative." She left. The door locked. Wesley looked down at the water on the floor. He looked up at the camera in the corner of the interview room, which was, he had noted on his way in, also not powered on. He let 5 seconds pass. Then, in the same small, deliberate motion, he raised his cuffed left wrist 1.5 inches above the table and held it there, long enough to photograph if anyone was watching through the one-way mirror on the south wall. The bruising from Marsh's cuff chain pull was now fully visible. 2 parallel bands of purpling tissue across the top of the wrist, with a small abrasion where the edge of the cuff had caught the skin. He lowered the wrist. He closed his eyes. He resumed the 4-7-8 breathing. He stayed that way for 22 minutes, at which point the door opened a final time and Kinnear came back in, unlocked the cuff from the bolt, and walked him back down the corridor to the holding cell. The walk took 31 steps. Wesley counted them again. He noted that the lighting in the corridor was dimmer than it had been on the walk over, which meant the building's overnight lighting schedule had engaged, which meant it was now past 10 p.m., which meant the number of officers in the building had dropped by roughly 60%, which meant the ratio he had been calculating since the stop, officers on duty to civilians in custody, was approaching the figure his training had taught him to track most carefully. The figure was not good. Kinnear locked him in the cell. Kinnear left. The fluorescent tube hummed above him. Wesley sat back down on the bench. He did not close his eyes this time. He kept them open and fixed on the small crack in the concrete where the seam between the wall and the floor did not quite meet. He watched it the way a man watches a doorway, because in a building like this, a crack in concrete was the only thing that was not going to change in the next hour. Everything else was about to. At 9:32 p.m., Captain Vernon Lusk sat at his desk in the watch commander's office of Precinct 19 and poured himself a second cup of coffee from the carafe his administrative assistant refreshed twice every shift. He was reviewing the evening's incident log. He had already signed off on the narcotics possession addendum to the Drayton booking. He had already approved the transfer request that would move the subject in the morning to the county intake facility, where the processing delay would extend at least through Monday. He was, by his own measure, having a productive Thursday. Across the hall, Commander Harlan Ives was on his cell phone in the parking lot, speaking in a low voice to a person whose name, if it had been audible, would have surprised Captain Lusk to hear. Ives had made the call from his personal cell, not his department-issued one, and he had walked to the far end of the lot before dialing. The person on the other end was a former department attorney who had left municipal service 4 years earlier and now ran a private firm with 3 police union contracts. The attorney was saying something Ives was listening to with the particular stillness of a man who had been given unwelcome information by a person he could not afford to ignore. The substance of the call was that Ives's anonymous tip source, the one that had identified Wesley by the name Andrew Drayton at 5:45 this morning, had just stopped responding to contact attempts at 7:50 p.m. The source had gone dark. The source had, in fact, stopped responding in the exact 5-minute window during which Dewey Fan had, without knowing he was doing it, begun imaging Lusk's home server. The attorney, who had no idea who Dewey Fan was and no idea what a home server was telling Ives, in careful language, that the arrangement Ives had entered into with the source was not the kind of arrangement that survived the source going dark, and that Ives should consider whether there were any items in his own office or his own vehicle that would be better moved to a secure location before the end of the night shift. Ives was listening. He was also calculating. In the back of the building, in a small office with the door closed, Sergeant Corinne Pratt was composing a memo to the shift supervisor in which she noted, in language that would prove meaningful in a federal hearing 6 months later, that she had personally overseen the booking and intake of subject Drayton, and that all procedures had been followed to department standard. She was lying. She knew she was lying. She was lying because that was the memo the shift supervisor expected to see, and she had worked too many years in this building to risk being the person whose memo did not match. In the holding cell at the end of the corridor, Wesley Drayton stood at the cell door with his forehead against the cool metal of the frame. He had made one calculation, and he had made it with the full weight of his experience. Carter Voss was in this building. Carter Voss had known for 11 days that Wesley was here. Carter Voss had arranged this arrest. Carter Voss would not permit Wesley to survive a second night in this building, which meant that whatever was going to happen before 6 a.m. tomorrow. Wesley turned away from the door. He sat back down on the metal bench. He closed his eyes. He began to wait. At 7:09 p.m., in a small room in the Memphis field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Dewey Fan pressed a final key and leaned back in his chair. On the screen in front of him was a directory listing of a server he had spent 2 hours locating, 11 minutes gaining red access to, and 41 minutes imaging. The server was not in a data center. It was not in the Precinct building. It was in a storage closet at the end of a residential street, in a small, unmarked rack behind a locked door, on a cable that ran through the sewer system to a ground-floor outlet in a house that appeared, on public record, to be owned by the captain of Precinct 19. Vernon Lusk's house. The directory listing contained 42,000 files. Dewey's screen showed, in the lower right corner, a small red counter, ticking. It read, "Time until next. Auto-overwrite. 4 hours, 52 minutes. He picked up the handset of the secure phone on the desk. He dialed the single extension he had been given. A man answered. The voice was one he had not heard before, but the tone was one he immediately recognized as authority. Report. I have the server. I have a read. I have approximately 4 hours before the next overwrite cycle. I need to tell you 3 things. Go. 1. The server is in the captain's house, not in the precinct. A small pause. 2. The files on the server include body cam footage from this morning's arrest at 6:04. I have reviewed the first 40 seconds. The captain uses a racial slur 4 times. The detainee does not resist at any point. The captain strikes the detainee in the face with an open hand at the 11-minute mark of the holding cell footage. Another pause. Shorter. 3. There is a file on this server that predates the precinct investigation. It is dated October of 2021. It contains, among other things, a set of identification documents for a man named Carter Voss. I cross-referenced the name. Mr. Voss was convicted of federal civil rights violations in 2013 in a case led by, according to the public record, an agent whose name matches the profile I was given for Wesley Drayton. I believe Mr. Voss is currently employed by Precinct 19 under a different name. The pause this time was longer. Who did he become? Dewey looked at the screen. He had already run the facial comparison. He had already matched the prints. He had already cross-referenced the payroll records of the department against the retired identification records of federal inmates. He had not wanted to say the name out loud until he had been asked. He became Detective Landon Marsh. The line was silent for 6 seconds. Then the voice came back, and it was different, flatter, harder, the voice of a man who had just understood that an operation he had signed off on 6 weeks ago had been compromised from inside the target jurisdiction from the day it began. Son, listen to me carefully. I need you to do 3 things, and I need you to do them in the next 10 minutes. Don't ask questions. Don't clarify. Just do them. Yes, sir. Secure everything you have pulled from that server into a hash-verified evidence package. Do it now. Doing it. Upload the package to the secure federal mirror at the address I am going to text you. Use the access key you were issued at onboarding. Yes, sir. And then, Mr. Fan, do not leave that office. Do not make any further outbound contact. There is a team on the way to your position to extract your mother from her residence. She is in danger. Do you understand? Dewey's hand on the mouse did not tremble. He had been raised by a woman who had run a small business in a hostile city for 16 years, and she had taught him that fear was a thing you could put in a drawer and deal with later. I understand. The team will be there in 19 minutes. Do not call her. Do not warn her. Any outbound signal from that block right now will trigger the people we have not yet identified. Your handler will brief you in person within the hour. Sir? Yes. What happens to the man in the cell? The voice did not answer immediately. When it answered, it said only, The man in the cell is about to have a very important visitor. You finish your job. Let us finish ours. The line went dead. Dewey turned back to the screen. The counter in the corner now read 4 hours 47 minutes. He began the hash. If you made it this far, you already know what's coming. Hit that like button and keep watching, because what happens when the FBI walks into this precinct is not something Captain Lusk has ever seen before. He did not know, because there was no way for him to know, that 3 miles away, in a room he had never seen, a 24-year-old man named Dewey Fawn had just finished hashing a 42,000-file evidence package and was watching the upload progress bar crawl toward the federal mirror. He did not know that his handler, sitting in the front passenger seat of a black SUV on Beale Ridge, had just received the notification that the upload had completed and that the hash had been verified by the Bureau's authentication server in Quantico. He did not know that the same handler had just keyed a phone and authorized, on the signature of the assistant director, the activation of a 6-agent tactical extraction team that had been on standby for 14 months, trained for a specific entry scenario at a specific building, and was now 8 minutes from the front doors of Precinct 19. He did not know that Dewey's mother, Fan Thi Lien, was at that moment sitting in the back of an unmarked federal sedan with a blanket over her shoulders, being driven to a safe location in Germantown, unharmed, confused, and asking the agent in the driver's seat, in her careful English, whether her son was going to be all right. Wesley did not know any of that. He only knew the pattern. The pattern said that the door was going to open sometime between now and sunrise, and either Carter Voss was going to walk through it, or the cavalry was. He sat. He breathed. He waited. The fluorescent tube above him hummed 1/2 step above a perfect A. At 9:51 p.m., he heard boots in the corridor. Not one set, not two, many, moving fast, moving with the particular rhythm of men who did not work in this building. The boots stopped outside the cell door. A voice Wesley did not recognize, but whose cadence he did, said 3 words into a radio mic. "We have entry." The lock clicked twice. Then silence. Part 2. The door swung open. Not Carter Voss. Not a uniformed officer of Precinct 19. Special Agent Noelle Vickers, Federal Bureau of Investigation, wearing a tactical vest over her blazer, with her sidearm holstered and her credentials held open at the height of the cell's interior camera, stepped across the threshold. Behind her, in the corridor, Wesley could see 3 other agents in identical vests, one of them speaking into a radio, 2 of them holding at the end of the hall with their hands at low ready position. Further behind them, at the corner of the corridor where it turned toward the booking room, a 4th agent was already producing a folded document from a breast pocket and handing it to a precinct officer whose face had gone the specific color a face goes when a person is watching the ground beneath him shift. Vickers did not say Wesley's name out loud. She said instead, "ASAC, we are clear. Extraction authorized. On your feet when you're ready." Wesley was already on his feet. He walked out of the cell. He did not look back at the bench. He did not look at the camera. He walked the 31 steps back down the corridor. He counted them a third time because counting was what he did. And he stepped into the booking room, which at 9:53 p.m. on a Thursday was a different place than it had been at 2 p.m. Sergeant Corinne Pratt was seated in her desk chair, not standing. Her hands were on the desk, palms flat, the way a person who has been instructed to keep her hands visible keeps her hands visible. An agent Wesley did not recognize was standing 3 feet behind her with a body camera fixed on her chest level. The booking room's overhead lights were on at full brightness, which they had not been at his intake, and every surface in the room now carried the specific glow of a scene being documented to evidentiary standard. Officer Bryce Kinnear was not at his desk. Detective Landon Marsh was not at his either. Captain Vernon Lusk stepped out of the watch commander's office at the far end of the room as Wesley entered. He had a coffee cup in his left hand and a phone in his right. The phone was to his ear. The ear was flushed. Lusk saw Wesley. Lusk saw the tactical vest on Vickers behind him. Lusk saw the folded document the fourth agent was still extending toward him across the booking room. For 1 full second, Lusk did nothing. His face did the small thing that happens when a man's interior calculation collides with his exterior expectation and the two do not match. Then the phone came down. Then the coffee cup came down on the nearest desk, half of the coffee spilling onto a stack of arrest reports. "Who in the hell are you people?" The words came out of his throat like something he had been saving for a different occasion. "Captain Vernon Lusk." The fourth agent, whose name Wesley could not read from his angle, but whose shield pattern indicated senior field supervisor, kept the document extended. "I'm Special Agent Renwick, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is a target letter. You are hereby informed that you are the subject of a federal criminal investigation under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. This is a second document, a federal search warrant for the premises of this precinct, including all digital and physical records, executed under authority granted by United States District Judge Alma Betancourt at 7:43 p.m. this evening. This is a third document, a federal search warrant for your personal residence at 4826 Linden Creek Lane, executed concurrently by a separate team. You are not under arrest at this time. You are, however, instructed to remain on these premises and to cooperate with agents in the preservation of evidence. Do you understand what I have just said?" Lusk did not answer. Lusk moved. He took 1 step toward Wesley, who was standing 8 feet away. His shoulders squared. His jaw set in the particular way the jaw of a man sets when the reptilian layer of his brain has voted before the cortical layer has weighed in. Vickers moved faster. She stepped between them, and her hand came up, palm flat, at the captain's chest. A mirror, Wesley noted with the small interior smile of a man who appreciated a mirror when one appeared, of the gesture Lusk had used at 6:04 this morning. Vickers did not push. She did not need to. Her palm simply occupied the space Lusk had been moving into, and Lusk, whose training and whose self-preservation instincts were both intact even if his judgment was not, stopped moving. "Captain," her voice was level, "you want to step back from the assistant special agent in charge. You want to do it now." The phrase landed the way phrases like that land. Wesley watched Lusk's face process the 3 letters in sequence. ASAC, Assistant Special Agent in Charge. Wesley watched the captain look at him, for the first time, with the eyes of a person seeing the man in front of him rather than the costume. Lusk took 1 step back. "You." His voice was low. It had not yet found the volume it would eventually try to find. "You are—" "Wesley Drayton is my legal name," Wesley said. He had not spoken in 90 minutes. His voice was dry and steady. "I am an assistant special agent in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the southeastern region. I have been in this jurisdiction for 6 weeks under a field operation authorized by the United States Department of Justice under Title 34, United States Code, Section 12601. The operation is a pattern or practice investigation of this precinct, this watch rotation, and the officers assigned to it. The investigation is now in its closing phase. The closing phase began, "Captain, when you placed your hand on my chest on a public sidewalk at 6:04 a.m. Lusk opened his mouth. He did not get a word out, because at that moment, the door at the far end of the booking room opened and 2 more agents walked in, escorting Detective Landon Marsh, whose hands were cuffed in front of him and whose face, without the reading glasses he had been wearing earlier, was finally visible to Wesley at the angle Wesley needed to see it. The tilt of the head was exactly as Wesley remembered it from 2013. Carter Voss, 13 years older, 30 pounds heavier, bearded, balding, looked across the booking room at Wesley Drayton and did the only thing he could do, which was smile. "Hello, Andrew." The name. The retired cover name. The name Voss had remembered for a decade and had used at 5:45 this morning to place the phone call that had started all of this, hung in the air between them like a thing released from a jar. Wesley did not return the smile. "It's Wesley now, Carter." "Is it?" "It is." Voss laughed. It was a small laugh, a laugh that understood what the laugh was worth. "You had a good run, Drayton. 6 weeks. You almost made it." "I made it, Carter." "Did you?" "I made it by 6 hours." Voss's laugh stopped. He looked past Wesley at Vickers, at Renwick, at the cascade of documents being methodically laid across the booking room desks by agents in blue vests. He looked at Captain Lusk, whose face had gone through 6 separate colors in the last 90 seconds. He looked at the camera on the vest of the agent behind Pratt. Then he did the second thing he could do, which was move. He drove his shoulder forward, cuffed hands and all, toward the nearest agent escorting him, a younger agent who had not been expecting a shoulder strike from a cuffed detainee, and whose center line was therefore open. Voss's shoulder caught the agent just below the sternum. The agent stumbled back half a step. Voss twisted, got his cuffed hands under the agent's vest strap, and came up with the agent's sidearm half drawn from its holster before either of them had finished the motion. He did not finish the motion. He did not finish it because Wesley had moved too, and Wesley, who had stood motionless in a cell for 15 hours and taken a slap and a cuff chain pull and a poured cup of water without so much as a muscle twitch, had crossed the 8 feet between them in 3 steps and had put his right forearm across the back of Voss's neck and driven Voss's face downward into the edge of the booking desk at precisely the angle that a Federal Defensive Tactics instructor named Mike Reyes had drilled him on at Quantico 23 years earlier. The sidearm came loose. It hit the floor. It skittered 4 feet and stopped against the baseboard. Voss did not move. Wesley kept the forearm pressure for 2 seconds, which was all the time required. Then he eased off. He stepped back. He let 2 agents, Vickers and Renwick both moving in now, take custody of Voss, who was bleeding from a split lip and whose cuffed hands were now being resecured to a waist chain. Wesley picked up the sidearm. He cleared the chamber. He ejected the magazine. He laid both the weapon and the magazine on the booking desk, muzzle pointed away from every person in the room. He looked at Vickers. "Get him out of my sight." "Yes, sir." They took Voss out. Wesley turned back to Captain Lusk, who had not moved, who was still standing in the middle of the booking room holding a phone that was no longer to anyone's ear, whose 22 years in this building had just ended in 90 seconds in a way he was going to spend the rest of his life failing to fully understand. "Captain." "Yes." "Sit down at that desk. Do not touch the phone. Do not touch your weapon. Agent Renwick is going to read you a list. You are going to listen to it, and then you and I are going to have a conversation about a 5:45 a.m. phone call you took this morning." Lusk sat down. If you've been waiting for this moment the entire video, tap that like button right now, because What's about to come out of this precinct is going to dismantle a 22-year career in real time. The precinct building at 10:11 p.m. on a Thursday was a different building from the one at 10 a.m. The overhead lights were on at the night shift dim-down protocol, but the booking room and the watch commander's office and the 2 interview rooms and the corridor leading to the cells were all lit at full. The fluorescent tubes hummed at their usual frequency. The smell of industrial lemon cleaner was still present. The difference was the uniforms. The uniforms were not Memphis police. They were federal. Dark blue vests, white letters across the back, the weight of an agency that did not belong to this city and could not be absorbed by it. In the parking lot, 2 black SUVs had been joined by 4 more. A white van marked Evidence Response Team was parked at the service entrance. Agents in latex gloves were moving a specific list of items, itemized and photographed and logged, from Lusk's office, from Marsh's desk, from the property locker, from the holding cell corridor, from the secondary server that was not in this building but whose existence was now known and whose complete image was now in the possession of the Bureau. In the watch commander's office, Wesley sat across from Captain Vernon Lusk. Renwick stood at the door. A body camera was running. A second agent, a woman in her 40s named Holmberg, was seated at the corner of the desk with a laptop open and a transcription app running. Wesley said very little. Wesley asked questions the way he had been taught to ask them, one at a time, in order, without emphasis, without pressure, with the specific flatness of tone that federal interviewers were taught because the flatness of tone did the work that raised voices could not. At what time did you receive the phone call? I don't recall. The log on your department-issued phone shows an incoming call at 5:43 a.m. Did you take that call? I take a lot of calls. This one was from a number registered to a prepaid cellular device purchased at a convenience store on Winchester Road on March 3rd. Is that a number you recognize? No. The call lasted 11 minutes. Is that consistent with your memory of your Thursday morning? I don't recall. Wesley did not press. He let the silences do the work. He let Lusk feel the silences. He let Lusk feel also the way Holmberg's fingers kept moving on the laptop keyboard during those silences, because the silences themselves were part of the record, and Lusk was intelligent enough to understand that. After the 7th, I don't recall, Wesley closed the folder in front of him. Captain, let me help you with something. You are not going to be arrested tonight. You are going to be served with notice of administrative suspension without pay, pending the outcome of an internal affairs investigation and a parallel federal criminal investigation. You are going to be allowed to drive home. You are going to sit in your house tonight and tomorrow morning, and probably for several weeks after that, waiting to find out whether a federal grand jury returns an indictment on Title 18, Section 242. Based on the evidence we have collected in the past 6 weeks, I want to be honest with you about the likelihood of that indictment. It is high. It is not certain. Nothing in a grand jury is certain, but it is high. Lusk said nothing. You have a choice, Captain. You can spend tonight and tomorrow and all the weeks between now and the grand jury returning its decision in silence. That is your right. I would not, in your position, choose it. The person who placed the 5:43 a.m. call to your phone, you know who he is. I know who he is. He has already been taken out of this building in federal custody. He is going to be offered, in the next 6 to 8 days, a cooperation agreement. He is going to take it. Because he has taken one before, and he knows how they work, and he knows what a federal cooperation agreement pays compared to what a federal indictment costs. When he takes it, Captain, he is going to become the first voice in a long queue of voices, and the first voice in that queue is the one that gets the best deal. The second voice gets a worse deal. The third voice gets whatever is left. You are tonight the second voice. You have until the grand jury convenes to decide whether you want to remain the second voice. After that, you are the third. Lusk looked at the desk. Lusk looked at the phone that was no longer in his hand. Lusk looked, very briefly, at Wesley's face. I want a lawyer. You are entitled to one. Agent Holmberg will provide you with a list of licensed criminal defense attorneys who accept federal cases. You may also contact the Fraternal Order of Police for a referral. This interview is concluded." Wesley stood up. He did not shake Lusk's hand. He did not extend any courtesy. He walked out of the watch commander's office of Precinct 19, and he did not look back, because there was nothing left in that office for him to look at. In a small, secure conference room at the Memphis field office, 12 minutes later, Dewey Fan sat at a long table with a cup of coffee he had not touched, and a face that had not yet figured out what expression it was supposed to be making. His mother was seated beside him, wrapped in a blue FBI-issued blanket, her hands folded around a cup of tea she had also not touched, speaking in low Vietnamese to an agent whose grandparents, judging by the syllables she was using, had been from the same province as Lien's. The agent was smiling, which Dewey had not seen a federal agent do in the 6 hours since this had begun. Wesley Drayton walked in. Dewey stood up. He did not mean to. His body did it before his mind decided whether standing was appropriate. Wesley looked at him. "Mr. Fan, sir." The word came out in the voice Dewey had been using with Wesley for 3 weeks, through a screen, in a workspace he had not known was Wesley's. He said it the way he had said it every time, and this time Wesley smiled very slightly, for the first time since the stop at 6:04, and said, "Your mother is safe." "I can see that. Your mother is safe because you moved fast enough. You understand what you did tonight." "I think so." "Tell me what you think you did." Dewey considered the question. He had not been asked many questions like it in his life. He decided to answer it the way his father had taught him to answer questions he was not sure about, which was to answer only the part he was sure about. "I pulled 42,000 files off a server belonging to a man who was abusing my mother, and 46 other people. I hashed them. I uploaded them. I got them onto a federal mirror before they could be overwritten." "That is correct. You also, Mr. Fan, while you were doing that, identified a man I have been looking for 6 weeks. A man whose name I did not know this morning. You gave me that name. The time you gave it to me was the time I needed to have it, which was 28 minutes before the extraction team reached the precinct. If you had given me that name 40 minutes later, the man would have been in the same building as me when the team arrived, and he would have had a weapon, and he would have used it." Dewey swallowed. "I didn't know any of that." "You did not need to know it. You only needed to do your job." "You did. Now I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, and then I'm going to let you take your mother home." "Yes, sir." "I am going to ask you to be available for testimony in a federal grand jury proceeding in 6 weeks, and for testimony in a public administrative hearing in 3 days, and for an expert technical deposition in a civil action that will be filed within 90 days. Your identity will be protected to the extent protection is possible. Your name will be entered into the record. You will become, very publicly, the technical witness in a federal civil rights case. Do you understand what that will mean for your life?" "Yes, sir." "Are you prepared to do it?" Dewey looked at his mother. His mother was looking at him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Dewey had been raised by this woman. He already knew the answer she would give. He knew the answer he would give. "I'm prepared." "Good." Wesley turned to Lean. He switched into the register he had been taught over many years to use with complainants. Flat, respectful, unhurried, no performance. "Mrs. Fan." "Yes." "The investigation that has been open on your business and 46 other people in this city has been open for 11 months. I want you to know that the men who came to your salon on 11 Tuesdays this year and the men who came before them are going to be identified, and their conduct is going to be documented in a public record, and 2 of them, the sergeant and the officer who entered your salon in February and asked you whether you were in this country legally, are going to be named in a pattern or practice suit filed by the Department of Justice against the Memphis Police Department. I want you to know that this suit is going to be filed regardless of whether you choose to participate in it. I am not asking you to participate. I am asking you only to know that it is being filed, that your name will be in it if you consent to it being in it, and that if you choose to participate, you will be one of 47 complainants whose voices will matter in that proceeding. You do not have to decide tonight." Leon looked at him for a long time. "Who are you?" I am a federal agent. Are you a good man? Wesley did not answer the question immediately. It was not a question he was often asked directly, by people who had reason to ask it, in rooms where they were entitled to an honest answer. I try to be, ma'am. She nodded. She looked at her son. She looked back at Wesley. Then I will put my name on your paper. At 11:12 p.m., a press release went out from the Memphis field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was brief. It did not name individual officers. It announced only that federal warrants had been executed at Precinct 19 of the Memphis Police Department in connection with an ongoing investigation of civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, and that further information would be made available at a joint press conference scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning at the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of Tennessee. The press release was picked up by a local reporter at 11:17. By 11:34, the story had reached the Commercial Appeal newsroom. By midnight, it was on 3 local television stations. By 6 a.m., it was national. And by 9 a.m., when Assistant United States Attorney Elena Cortez stood behind a podium with a Department of Justice seal and began reading, in her careful and unhurried voice, the scope of the pattern or practice investigation that had been open for 14 months. There were 41 cameras in the room, and a wire service photographer had already called the shot of her reading the phrase, "deprivation of rights under color of law." Cortez was 39 years old. She had been with the Civil Rights Division for 11 years. She had prosecuted 7 pattern or practice cases. She had lost 1. She had the specific calm of a woman who had stood behind this kind of podium often enough to know that calm was the only thing the cameras would remember. She read the statute. She read the jurisdictional basis. She read a summary of the underlying incidents, without naming individuals, without naming the complainant who had been arrested the previous morning, without disclosing the existence of the secondary server or the identity of the federal agent who had been in custody for 15 hours. She read, finally, the list of actions the Department of Justice was taking today. The United States had filed, at 6:30 this morning, a pattern or practice lawsuit against the city of Memphis under Title 34, Section 12601. The suit named the Memphis Police Department as defendant. The relief sought was injunctive, a consent decree requiring federal monitoring of specific practices, including use of force, documentation of stops, body camera compliance, and civilian complaint processing. The timeline for negotiation of the consent decree was, she noted carefully, expected to span 6 to 12 months. The United States had also, at 7 a.m., convened a federal grand jury in the Western District of Tennessee. The grand jury was, as of this morning, considering evidence in a parallel criminal investigation of individual officers. She would not name those officers. She would not discuss the evidence. She would say only that indictments, if returned, would be expected within 60 to 90 days, and that the evidence being presented included digital forensics, body-worn camera footage, physical evidence in federal custody, and testimony from federal agents and civilian witnesses. The third action was administrative. The city of Memphis had, at 8:15 this morning, announced the initiation of internal affairs proceedings against 6 officers of Precinct 19. The 6 officers had been placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of those proceedings. She named none of them. She took 3 questions. She answered 2 of them with the phrase, "I cannot comment on an open investigation." She answered the third, which was about timeline, by saying only that federal civil rights cases are resolved on the timeline of the evidence, and that she was not prepared to predict how long the evidence would take. She stepped away from the podium. A federal press officer stepped forward to close the briefing. The cameras began to reset for reaction shots. The reporters began to file out toward their own cameras for the hallway stand-ups that would run at noon. In the back of the room, unseen by any camera, Wesley Drayton stood with his back against the rear wall, in a dark suit without a tie, next to Noel Vickers. He had slept for 4 hours. He had not yet been in front of any press. He had agreed with Elena Cortez and with the assistant director that he would not be named in any public filing for at least 30 days for the sake of the Federal Mirror operation, which had not yet been fully extracted from Precinct 19. He watched Cortez leave the podium. He watched the reporters file out. He watched 2 rows forward a figure he recognized. A woman in a gray cardigan with a notebook on her lap and reading glasses pushed up into her short, natural hair, close her notebook without having asked a question. The woman stood up. She turned. She saw him at the back wall. She nodded once. He nodded once. Neither of them spoke. Her name was Tanya Briggs. She had been, for the past 14 years, the senior investigator at the EEOC Charlotte District Office, and she had, in a previous case involving a janitor named Nolan Greer in a building called the Marion, filed a report that had become part of a federal pattern analysis on discriminatory termination practices in building services. She was visiting the Memphis office today on a different matter. She had not known, until she walked into this press conference, that the agent she had corresponded with by encrypted channel last spring was in this room. She did not approach him. She left through the rear door. Wesley watched her go. He turned to Vickers. Administrative hearing. 11 a.m., Municipal Building, City Council Chamber, 4th floor. Marsh. Still at the Federal Detention Facility. Initial appearance at 2 p.m. this afternoon. He has retained a private attorney, a Mr. Weller. I know the name. He also represented the Memphis FOP in the prior internal affairs matter from 1919, the one that got dismissed. I remember. Sir? Yes. He is going to try to put you on the stand. Weller. He is going to try to make the case that your 6 weeks of undercover operation constituted entrapment. He is going to argue that you personally manufactured the circumstances of your own arrest, and therefore that no federal civil rights violation occurred because the arrest was not organic. I know what he's going to argue. Are you prepared for it? Wesley looked at the empty podium. I have been prepared for it since April. The administrative hearing at 11 a.m. in the City Council chamber was not the federal proceeding. It was a municipal proceeding. It had, under the Memphis Municipal Code and the collective bargaining agreement between the City of Memphis and the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 24, a specific structure and a specific timetable. And the structure and the timetable meant that no officer was going to be terminated at this hearing. Termination, if it came at all, would come at the end of a multi-month internal affairs review and a separate Civil Service Commission hearing and any appeal arising from that hearing. The administrative hearing today was a procedural step. Its only immediate function was to place the 6 officers of Precinct 19 formally on administrative leave without pay, to acknowledge receipt of the federal documentation, and to confirm the commencement of the internal affairs investigation. The chamber was full. It had been full since 10. The 6 officers were not present. They had been instructed by counsel not to appear. Their collective representation had been accepted on their behalf by Mr. Weller, who sat at the respondent table with a gray suit and a binder, and a face that carried the specific composure of an attorney who has been in this chamber more times than he cared to count. At the complainant table sat Assistant City Attorney Brenda Malhotra, who had been awake since 4 a.m. and had a travel cup of coffee that was her 3rd since arriving at the building. Beside her, at her right hand, sat Detective Lieutenant Ramona Ortiz, Internal Affairs Division, who had been in the division for 7 years and had, as of 7:30 this morning, been formally assigned to lead the IA investigation of Precinct 19. In the public gallery, in the 2nd row from the front, sat Dewey Fan. He was wearing a button-down shirt, pressed, and a pair of dark slacks his mother had insisted he wear. His mother was not present. She had asked him that morning at breakfast whether it would be useful for her to attend, and he had said no, because he knew, and had been told, that her name would come up in this hearing, and he knew that the way her name would come up would not be the way a person should first hear their own name said in a public proceeding. She had nodded. She had gone back to her appointment book. Next to Dewey sat a man in his early 60s, in a dark gray suit with a small lapel pin shaped like a cross. His name was Pastor Clarence Odom. He had pastored the Beale Ridge Missionary Baptist Church for 19 years. His congregation included 11 of the 47 civilian complainants in the pattern or practice investigation. He had been asked by the city attorney's office to attend this hearing as an observer. He was not asked to testify. He had, however, brought a list of names in his inside jacket pocket, because that was what he had done every time he had entered this chamber for the past 19 years, and he saw no reason to change the practice today. The hearing was called to order at 11:06. The city attorney read the procedural notice. The IA lieutenant read the summary of federal documentation received overnight. Mr. Weller stood at the respondent table and entered, on the record, the formal objection of his clients to the sufficiency of the notice, the sufficiency of the documentation, the sufficiency of the procedural basis for the hearing, and the sufficiency of the federal warrant pursuant to which the evidence had been collected. Each objection was noted for the record. Each objection was overruled. Each objection was going to be relitigated in a later proceeding, and everyone in the chamber understood that fact, and no one in the chamber pretended otherwise. At 11:41, the chair of the hearing, a former judge named Marcia Devlin, 71, retired from the circuit bench 6 years earlier, called the first witness. The first witness was Detective Lieutenant Ortiz. She walked to the witness table with a folder. She was sworn in. She read, for the record, the summary of the preliminary IA findings, which included the booking room body cam footage, the booking room narrative discrepancies, the affidavit of probable cause filed by Officer Kinnear citing Tennessee Code Section 39-14-405, criminal trespass of a structure, as grounds for a stop that had occurred on a public sidewalk, which did not meet the statutory definition of a structure, and which therefore could not sustain the charge. Mr. Weller stood up. Lieutenant, are you qualified to offer a legal opinion on the applicability of Tennessee Code Section 39-14-405? I'm not offering a legal opinion. I'm reading from the city attorney's preliminary memorandum. On what authority? On the authority of my IA investigation, which commenced this morning at 7:30. This morning? Yes. Lieutenant, you are asking this body to credit an IA finding made in approximately 3 hours. I am asking this body to note that the charging document on its face cites a statute that does not apply to the conduct alleged. Whether that is a finding or an observation, I will leave to the chair. The chair made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Noted, Lieutenant. Continue. Weller sat down. Ortiz continued. She read the summary of the planted narcotics, referring to it, carefully, as the substance recovered during booking, which was the formal phrasing she had been instructed to use because the word planted was a legal conclusion that this hearing was not empowered to make. She noted that the field test had returned positive for methamphetamine. She noted that the chain of custody on the substance showed a 12-minute gap between the alleged recovery and the logging of the substance into evidence. She noted that during that 12-minute gap, 3 officers had physically handled the bag without gloves, and that the booking room camera footage for that 12-minute window showed an irregular upload signature. The signature Dewey had flagged 3 weeks earlier, and which had now been authenticated by the Bureau's Digital Forensics Unit. She did not identify Dewey by name. She did, however, note that the digital forensics supporting her finding had been conducted by a civilian technical consultant under contract to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that the technical consultant would be available for questions if the chair wished to call him. The chair looked at Dewey across the chamber. Dewey stood up. Dewey walked to the witness table. He was sworn in. He sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table. He was 24 years old, and he had not slept more than 3 hours in the past 30, and the only person in the public gallery who was looking at him with anything other than professional interest was Pastor Odom, who gave him a small nod as Dewey passed him on the way to the table. The chair asked his name. He gave it. The chair asked his profession. I'm a technical consultant specializing in digital forensics and information security. I hold a Bachelor of Science from the University of Memphis. For the past 3 weeks, I have been under contract with the Federal Bureau of Investigation as an external technical consultant. Mr. Fan, can you describe in layman's terms what you were asked to do? I was asked to audit the public data handling practices of several municipal agencies. One of those agencies was the Memphis Police Department. I was asked to compare the timestamps in the publicly accessible arrest log against the timestamps in the department's incident database, and to flag any records where the two did not match within a 5-minute window. And what did you find? I found 71 records that did not match. Out of how many? Out of approximately 3,400 records in the comparison period. Is that a normal number? No. What is a normal number? In my professional experience, 0. The two databases are supposed to be updated from the same dispatch system. A mismatch indicates that at least one of the two records was manually edited after the fact. The chamber was quiet. Mr. Fan, can you give this body an example of one such mismatch? Dewey looked at Weller, who was watching him with the stillness of a trial attorney who has correctly identified a witness he would prefer not to cross-examine. Yes, on March 3rd of this year, at 9:47 p.m., a 911 call was logged to dispatch from a residence on Clarksdale Avenue. The call was a noise complaint. The dispatcher's record shows that the caller's address was 1314 Clarksdale. The department's public incident database, however, shows that the responding unit was dispatched to 1413 Clarksdale. The addresses are not adjacent. They are in different blocks. The responding officers, according to their own body camera footage, entered the residence at 1413 Clarksdale and conducted a search of the premises. The occupant of 1413 Clarksdale, a Ms. Danelle Washburn, was handcuffed and detained for 48 minutes. She was not charged. She filed a complaint 7 days later. The complaint was closed without finding. And the address discrepancy. The address discrepancy was corrected in the department's public incident database at 2:04 a.m. on March 4th, approximately 6 hours after the incident. The correction changed the dispatch address from 1413 to 1314, matching the original 911 call. So the incident log was altered. Yes. By whom? The edit log on the database entry shows the user ID of the officer who made the change. That user ID belongs to Sergeant Corinne Pratt. A sound moved through the chamber. Weller stood up. Mr. Fan, are you offering expert testimony as to the authenticity of internal department records? I'm offering factual testimony as to what the records show. On what authority have you accessed those records? On the authority of the federal search warrant executed last night, pursuant to which the records were lawfully obtained and provided to me for technical analysis. Weller sat down. The chair made a note. She asked Dewey to continue. He continued. He walked the body, for the next 41 minutes, through 8 more such mismatches. Each mismatch was a civilian complaint. Each civilian complaint was a name. Each name was a person whose Tuesday or Wednesday or Saturday had been disrupted by a unit dispatched to the wrong address. Not accidentally, because the pattern was too consistent to be accidental, but deliberately, with the purpose of generating an after-the-fact record that matched the post hoc narrative of why the officers had been at the door of the person whose door they had entered. At 12:49 p.m., the chair called a recess. Dewey stepped down from the witness table. He walked back to the gallery. Pastor Odom stood up and shook his hand. Odom did not speak. He did not need to. Dewey sat back down beside him. In the hallway outside the chamber, during the recess, a man in an off-duty sweatshirt, blue jeans, no badge visible, no uniform, stepped into the path of Dewey's mother, who had arrived at noon despite her son's request that she not come, and who was walking down the hallway from the elevator toward the chamber doors. The man was in his late 40s. He was broad. He had the specific posture of an off-duty patrol officer who had not, this morning, been placed on administrative leave because he was not from Precinct 19. He was from Precinct 22. He had a cousin in Precinct 19 whose name was on the list of 6. He did not know Leanne's name. He knew her face. He had seen it in the folder on his cousin's desk. He stepped in front of her. He did not touch her. He said, in the low and even voice men use when they are trying to communicate a threat without crossing the line into a charge, "You really want to do this." Leanne was 5 feet tall. She was 52. She had been in this country for 29 years. She had been a widow for 8 of them. She had, in her pocket, a laminated card with the phone number of the agent who had driven her home last night, and the phone number of her son's lawyer, and a small laminated copy of her naturalization certificate. She did not need to touch any of them. She looked up at the man. "Yes." "You sure about that?" "Yes." "Your kind always think you're sure." The woman behind Lien, an older black woman in a church hat whom Lien did not know, but who had arrived in the hallway 40 seconds earlier and had been walking behind Lien toward the chamber, stepped forward. The woman was Mrs. Olima Joyner. She had been a member of Pastor Odom's congregation for 31 years. She had come to this hearing because her grandson, a 19-year-old named Deshaun, was complainant number 31 in the pattern or practice file. She was wearing, under her coat, a navy blue blazer with a pin that read, Deaconess. She did not know Lien either. She had not exchanged a word with her. She stepped around Lien. She stopped between Lien and the man. She was 6 inches shorter than he was, and 83 years old. "You take one more step toward this lady, son, and I will stand in this hallway, and I will scream until every agent on this floor comes running, and I will tell each one of them exactly what I just saw. You understand me?" The man looked at her. The man looked at Lien. The man looked at the hallway, at the fact that there were 2 uniformed federal agents visible at the far end of it, at the fact that the camera on the wall above the elevator was on. The man stepped aside. "Ma'am, I didn't mean—" "I do not care what you meant. You take the next elevator. You go back wherever you came from." He did. Mrs. Joyner did not move from her position in the hallway until the elevator doors had closed behind him. Then she turned to Lien. She did not smile. She did not introduce herself. She simply said, "Come on, baby. Let's get you in that room." She walked Lien to the chamber doors. She held the door. She let Lien go in first. She sat down beside her, in the second row, next to Dewey and Pastor Odom. Dewey did not know at that moment what had happened in the hallway. He would find out 4 hours later, when his mother told him, in Vietnamese, in the car, in a single sentence that did not mention Mrs. Joyner's name, but that did include the phrase, "An elderly woman was kind to me." This is the part where people start to understand what it actually takes. Tap that like button and stay with me, because what closes out on this precinct is not what you've been trained to expect. The administrative hearing resumed at 1:15 p.m. and ran until 4:12 p.m. At the close of the hearing, the chair issued the following rulings from the bench, which she read from a prepared statement that had been drafted during the afternoon recess. Captain Vernon Lusk, assigned to Precinct 19, was placed on administrative leave without pay, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the Internal Affairs investigation and any subsequent Civil Service Commission review. The leave was not termination. It did not carry a predetermined endpoint. It did not include forfeiture of accrued pension benefits. Mr. Weller, on Captain Lusk's behalf, entered an objection to the leave on procedural grounds, which was noted and overruled. Commander Harlan Ives, Division Commander over Precinct 19, was placed on paid administrative leave, pending the outcome of a parallel IA investigation into his handling of the prior civilian complaints and the substance of a phone call placed from his personal cellular phone at 9:34 p.m. on the previous evening. Commander Ives had, through counsel, submitted a written statement earlier in the afternoon indicating his intention to retire, effective the end of the current pay period, with full pension benefits. The chair noted that the announced retirement did not terminate the IA investigation, which would proceed concurrently with the federal grand jury. Sergeant Corinne Pratt was placed on administrative leave without pay, pending IA investigation, with particular reference to the edits to the incident database that had been documented by the technical consultant in open hearing. Officer Bryce Kinnear was placed on administrative leave without pay, pending IA investigation, with reference to the affidavit of probable cause. Detective Landon Marsh was not addressed by the administrative hearing because Detective Landon Marsh was not present, because Detective Landon Marsh was at that moment being held without bond at the federal detention facility pending his initial appearance before a United States magistrate judge at 2 p.m. on charges that were not yet public, but that included, according to the sealed grand jury materials, violations of Title 18. Section 242, Title 18, Section 1519. Destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in a federal investigation, and Title 18, Section 1001, false statements to federal investigators. A sixth officer, a patrol officer named David Brinks, who had not been a main character in the overnight operation, but whose name had surfaced in the booking room camera footage as having been present during the planted narcotics sequence, and as having logged a false timestamp entry in support of Detective Marsh's narrative, was placed on paid administrative leave pending IA investigation. The chair noted, in closing, that the City of Memphis had, through the City Attorney's Office, committed to cooperation with the federal consent decree negotiation. The specifics of the consent decree would be handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice, and were not within the scope of this hearing. The chair banged her gavel once. The hearing adjourned. Mr. Weller collected his binder. He walked out of the chamber without looking at either the complainant table or the gallery. In the elevator, alone, he placed a call to a number that was not in his phone's contact list, and he spoke for 2 minutes in a voice too low to be overheard, and he ended the call with the single word, understood. The number he had called was the phone number of a former federal inmate named Carter Voss, who was, at that moment, sitting in an interview room at the federal detention facility with his attorney, who was a different attorney than Weller, and who was listening to a man in his 30s whose name was David Eng explain, in the careful and unhurried language of a federal prosecutor, the specific structure of a cooperation agreement. Voss was listening. Voss was, specifically, listening to the part of the agreement that described which information the government was interested in and which information would not count toward the cooperation credit. Voss was calculating. At 6:43 p.m., Voss asked his attorney for a recess. At 7:11 p.m., Voss signed a preliminary proffer agreement. At 7:19 p.m., Voss began to name names. The names he named included Harlan Ives, whose role in the 5:45 a.m. tip Voss described in detail that the federal agents had not previously confirmed. The names included a city council member whose name was under seal but whose initials, J.D., would appear in a grand jury indictment 6 weeks later. The names included a retired deputy chief who had left the department in 2019 and had been employed, since 2020, as a lobbyist for a firm whose clients included the FOP. Voss did not name Weller. That was a decision Voss made deliberately because Weller had not been involved in Voss's 2013 case and was not, in Voss's assessment, actually part of the criminal conspiracy. Weller was an attorney. Weller had been hired on the night of the arrest. Weller's subsequent phone call to the federal detention facility to inquire about Voss had been, Voss believed, the action of an attorney servicing a client the FOP had retained him to service, not the action of a conspirator. That assessment would later prove correct, in the sense that no charges were ever filed against Weller. Voss's proffer continued until 11:20 p.m. At 12:14 a.m. on Saturday, Voss was transported from the federal detention facility to a cooperating witness housing unit at a separate federal building in a different jurisdiction. He would not return to Memphis except under federal escort, for specific testimony, at specific hearings, over the course of the next 11 months. 2 weeks after the administrative hearing, on a Thursday at 11 a.m., the City of Memphis and the Department of Justice signed a preliminary framework agreement for the negotiation of a federal consent decree. The framework agreement was not the consent decree. The consent decree itself would take between 6 and 9 months to finalize. The framework agreement was, however, the formal public acknowledgement that the city intended to cooperate, and it included 4 specific interim commitments. First, the city committed to the appointment of a federal monitor for the Memphis Police Department, whose selection process would begin within 30 days. The monitor, once appointed, would have access to all department records and would report quarterly to the court. Second, the city committed to the immediate implementation of a revised use of force reporting standard, effective at the start of the next fiscal quarter, subject to department and union review. Third, the city committed to a civilian complaint processing overhaul, which would include transfer of complaint intake from the Internal Affairs Division to an independent civilian review board, the details of which would be negotiated as part of the consent decree. Fourth, the city committed to a public acknowledgement, through a letter signed by the mayor and the acting chief of police, to the 47 complainants in the pattern or practice case. The letter would not constitute an admission of individual liability. It would acknowledge, however, that the pattern of conduct documented in the federal investigation was inconsistent with the standards the department had committed to, and that the city regretted the conduct and was taking steps to prevent its recurrence. The letter was delivered by certified mail to the 47 complainants on a Tuesday morning in early June. Lean received her letter in the mail at 1:40 p.m. between a highlight client and a manicure client. She opened it at the front desk of Tin Shuan Nails. She read the first paragraph. She read the second paragraph. She folded the letter back into the envelope. She placed the envelope in a manila folder in the back office, next to 29 years of tax returns and lease agreements and the naturalization certificate she had hung behind the register in 1997. She did not cry. She had cried in 1995 when she had arrived in this country. She had cried in 2008 when her husband had had the stroke. She had cried in 2016 when the business had nearly failed. She had decided, after 2016, that she was finished crying. Today did not change the decision. She placed the folder in the cabinet. She closed the cabinet. She walked back to the front of the salon. She called the next client up from the waiting area. The black electrical tape on the front window was not there that day. It had not been there for 6 weeks. No one had come by on a Tuesday evening during those 6 weeks to put it back. Lean noticed. She noticed every Tuesday and every Thursday, and the absence of the tape became, in the way that absences become things, a presence. A presence she did not describe to her son, or to her clients, or to anyone, because it did not need description. It only needed to be there. The consent decree negotiation continued. It ran through the summer. It ran into the fall. It was not a transformation. It was a grinding, bureaucratic, attrition-driven process of clause-by-clause language revision in which every commitment the city made was matched against every objection the police union raised, and every objection the police union raised was matched against every counter from the DOJ attorneys, and every counter from the DOJ attorneys was filed, footnoted, indexed, and preserved in a growing file that eventually ran to 11,400 pages. The consent decree was signed at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. It was immediately challenged, in a filing by the FOP, on 6 separate procedural grounds. 3 of those challenges would be resolved in the city's favor. 2 would be resolved in the union's favor. 1 would remain under litigation for another 3 years. This was, Wesley understood, the actual shape of reform, not an announcement, not a headline, not a moment of triumph. A document in a file, a monitor in a conference room, a quarterly report no one read, a use of force form with a new field on it, a civilian complaint intake number a person could call that would not be answered by the person who had been the subject of the complaint. Small things. Small, slow things. And underneath them, some things that did not change. The culture of the break room, the way a sergeant reads a file out loud to an audience of subordinates, the way an off-duty officer stands in a hallway in front of a woman who is there to listen to testimony about her own salon. These things were not in the consent decree. They could not be in a consent decree. They would be addressed, if they were addressed at all, by a generation of training classes and a generation of new recruits, and the slow attrition of the officers who had entered the profession at a different time and under a different understanding of what the profession meant. Wesley knew this. He had always known this. It was why he had not, in his 21 years with the Bureau, allowed himself to celebrate the end of any operation. The grand jury returned its first wave of indictments in early August. 4 officers were indicted. Detective Landon Marsh, who had by then been in cooperating witness status for 11 weeks, was not indicted in the first wave. His cooperation agreement deferred formal charges pending the completion of the testimony cycle. The 4 officers who were indicted were Captain Vernon Lusk, Sergeant Corinne Pratt, Officer Bryce Kinnear, and Officer David Brinks. The charges were laid out under Title 18, Section 242, with additional counts of Title 18, Section 1519, for Pratt and Brinks based on the database edits. Commander Harlan Ives was not indicted in the first wave. His name appeared in the indictment as an unindicted co-conspirator. His attorney indicated, through a written statement, that Commander Ives denied any criminal conduct and would defend any future allegations vigorously. The grand jury continued to receive testimony regarding Ives's conduct through the end of the year. Lusk entered a plea of not guilty at arraignment. He retained a new attorney. His case was scheduled for trial in March of the following year. The trial would be continued 3 times, for reasons that ranged from a discovery dispute to an unrelated defense attorney family matter, before finally being resolved, not at trial, but through a negotiated plea. Lusk pled guilty in July, 14 months after his administrative suspension, to a single count of deprivation of rights under color of law, with the additional counts dismissed. He received a sentence of 36 months in federal custody and a lifetime bar from employment in law enforcement. The sentence was, in the view of every civil rights attorney Wesley knew, less than the conduct deserved. It was also, under federal sentencing guidelines, what the evidence against Lusk could reliably support at the point of plea. Pratt pled guilty 6 weeks after Lusk. She received 24 months. She did not serve the full sentence. She was released to a halfway house after 16. Kinnear took his case to trial. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury deliberated 11 hours. The jury returned a guilty verdict on one of the 3 counts, and a not guilty verdict on the other 2. Kinnear received 18 months, of which he served 14. Brinks pled guilty, received 12 months, and served 9. Marsh, Carter Voss, was sentenced in a sealed proceeding after the completion of his cooperation cycle. The details of the sentence were not public. His name disappeared from the federal inmate locator 31 days after the sentencing, which Wesley understood to mean either the witness security program or a medical release. He did not inquire further. He did not need to know. Ives was never indicted. He was, however, named as a defendant in a civil suit filed by the Fan family and 11 other complainants in the spring of the following year. The suit sought damages under Title 42, Section 1983, Civil Action for Deprivation of Rights. The suit was still in discovery 18 months later, mired in the kind of document production fights that had come to define these cases. It would eventually settle, in a separate proceeding, in a result that satisfied no one fully and all of the plaintiffs partially. This was, Wesley knew, the shape of it. In the week after the indictments, on a Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m., Wesley drove to Tinchwan Nails. He parked across the street, in the strip mall lot where a Precinct 19 cruiser had sat, with its lights off for 2 years. He did not get out of his car. He watched the salon open for the day. He watched Leanne unlock the front door, carry a small potted plant from the inside step to the outside step, and walk back in. He watched Dewey come out of the apartment upstairs, wave to his mother, and drive off to a new apartment he had leased in a different part of the city, at the Bureau's recommendation, in which a second-floor window faced a quiet street, and a back door led to a parking lot that was not monitored by any municipal camera. Dewey had taken a full-time position with a cybersecurity firm in Nashville. He had continued on a limited retainer as a technical consultant to the Civil Rights Division. He had, in the past 4 months, completed the testimony cycle that Wesley had warned him about. He had appeared in court 3 times. He had given 1 deposition. He had filed 1 sworn affidavit in support of the civil suit. His name was now a matter of public record. He had received, in the 6 weeks after his second testimony, 7 separate death threats, which had been logged with the Bureau, 2 of which had resulted in the identification and arrest of their authors. His mother's salon was still open. She had 21 clients a week. She had 2 new employees. She had, on the counter by the register, a small wooden stand that held a stack of business cards from a civil rights attorney who had offered, pro bono, to speak with any complainant whose complaint had not yet been included in the pattern or practice file. The attorney's name was Renee Vaughn. She was based in Los Angeles. She flew to Memphis every 6 weeks. Wesley watched the salon for 11 minutes. He did not go in. He drove home. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this case mattered. Tap that like button one last time, because the loose threads you're about to hear are the ones that made the next indictment possible. The Federal Mirror operation had been terminated in June. The sealed warrant under which it had operated had expired on schedule. The 42,000 files Dewey had recovered from Lusk's home server had been integrated into the main evidence index of the Western District, and the secondary server itself had been physically removed from the closet at the end of Linden Creek Lane during the execution of the search warrant, imaged a second time in a federal lab, and placed into evidence under a chain of custody that now included 4 agencies. Some of the files on that server had been explained. Some of them had not. 7 files in particular remained unexplained. They were encrypted with a key that was not in the primary partition. They were dated across a 6-year window. Their file names were alphanumeric strings of no obvious pattern, except that each file name began with the same 2 characters. JD, the initials. The same initials that had appeared, sealed, in the grand jury indictment. Dewey had worked on those 7 files for a total of 61 hours across 3 months. He had made partial progress on 3 of them. He had not cracked any of them completely. He had filed an interim technical report, noting that the encryption was consistent with a commercially available product that had been patched against the specific exploit path he was using, and that further progress would require either the primary encryption key or a cooperating witness with access to the key. The file had been marked, in the investigation index, as open technical inquiry. It was still open. Wesley kept a printed copy of the file name list in a folder in his desk drawer. He looked at it from time to time, the way a man who has worked in his profession for a long time looks at a list of names that have not yet stopped being names. In a second folder, in the same drawer, he kept a list of 3 dates. Each date corresponded to a 911 call log from Precinct 19 that contained a gap of between 8 and 11 minutes in its recording. The gaps were documented. They were known. They were not, technically, evidence of misconduct, because the department's aging recording infrastructure had a documented failure rate that could account for them in isolation. They were only anomalous when considered together in the pattern they formed, which was that all 3 of the gaps had occurred on the same 3 nights on which a civilian complaint had later been filed that related to a use-of-force incident by Precinct 19 officers. The 3 civilian complainants had not been part of the 47. They had, for reasons that were not in the public record, declined to join the pattern or practice file. Wesley did not know why. He did, however, keep their names in the folder. He kept, in a 3rd folder, an email that had been forwarded to him by the IA division in the week after the indictments. The email had been recovered from a backup of Commander Ives's department account. It was dated 11 months before the 6 a.m. arrest. It was addressed to a single recipient whose email address had been redacted at the server level, not by Ives, but by a piece of software running on the department's mail server, whose presence no one had yet been able to account for. The body of the email read, in full, "The asset you identified has been cleared for fieldwork. Proceed with site selection. H. The identity of the recipient had not been established. The identity of the asset had not been established. The software that had performed the redaction had been traced to a vendor account that had been closed in 2019. These were the loose ends. These were the things that did not close. These were the things that stayed in the drawer." 11 months after the 6 a.m. arrest, on a Tuesday in April, Wesley received an encrypted message from Dewey at 9:14 p.m. The message read, "I think I got one. Call me when you can." Wesley called him at 9:17. Dewey's voice was careful. It was the voice of a man who had learned, in the past year, the specific cost of being the first person to say a thing out loud. One of the encrypted files, the 4th one, the JD08/22, I got into it tonight. What's in it? It's a ledger, payments, across a 4-year window, routed through 3 LLCs. The accounts are with a credit union in Mississippi. Small deposits, never over $9,500, consistent with structuring. To whom? That's the part I want you to hear. The payments are inbound, not outbound. Somebody was paying into those accounts, regularly, for 4 years. Who was receiving? The account holder name on 2 of the LLCs is a shell. I'm still unwinding it. But the third LLC, the third one, has a real person. The real person is a sitting member of the Memphis City Council. Wesley closed his eyes. The same one the indictment sealed. Same initials. J.D. I haven't confirmed it's the same person, but the LLC's address of record is the rental address the council member listed on a campaign finance disclosure in 2022. How long will it take you to confirm? Maybe a week, maybe 10 days. I need to run it past legal. It's structuring, possibly honest services fraud, and I'm not going to be the one who makes that call on my own. You won't be. Send me what you have. I'll have it on David Eng's desk in the morning. He'll decide whether to pull a new warrant. Yes, sir. Dewey. Yes. You did a job tonight. Thank you, sir. Wesley hung up. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time. The overhead light in his kitchen was a single fluorescent tube, not a fixture he had chosen, but one that had come with the apartment he had moved into after the case closed, and he had left the cover apartment on Ashwood. The tube hummed. It was not the same frequency as the one in the cell at Precinct 19. It was a half-step lower. A perfect A-flat. He had noticed that once, when he first moved in, and had decided he did not mind it. He pulled his folder out of the drawer. He added to the list of unexplained files a single handwritten note in the margin next to JD08/22. The note read, "Ledger recovered, council involvement pending." He closed the folder. He placed it back in the drawer. He stood. He walked to the kitchen window. He looked out at the parking lot, at the cars, at the low buildings of his new neighborhood, at the sky that had gone from blue to purple to the specific dark gray that cities produce when their own lights begin to dominate the sky. 11 months had gone since Captain Vernon Lusk had placed his hand on Wesley's chest on a sidewalk at 6:04 a.m. on a Thursday in Maplewood Heights. The captain was in federal custody. The commander had retired. The sergeant was in a halfway house. The officer who had written the affidavit was 18 months in. The detective who had been Carter Voss was in witness security in a jurisdiction Wesley did not need to know. The pattern or practice lawsuit had produced a consent decree that had been signed, challenged, partially upheld, and was now being enforced by a federal monitor whose quarterly reports Wesley read the Monday after they were filed. The Tin Xuan Nails Salon on Beale Ridge was open 6 days a week. A 25-year-old Vietnamese-American cybersecurity analyst whose name was Dewey Phan had, on this Tuesday evening in April, cracked one of the 7 unexplained files and found, inside it, the first verifiable link between the conduct of Precinct 19 and an elected official of the city of Memphis. A grand jury would be convened. A new indictment would, or would not, be returned. The process would be slow. The outcome would be partial. Wesley did not know what the outcome would be. He had never known what the outcome would be. He had only ever known what the next step was. He turned away from the window. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. In the morning, he would call David Eng at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He would forward the file Dewey had sent. He would begin the 5th process he had begun in the past 11 months of exactly this type, and he would do it in exactly the same way, with the same discipline and the same patience and the same internal acceptance that the work would not be finished by his retirement, or by his children's retirement, or perhaps ever. In a small apartment on a quiet street, 2 miles from Wesley's own, Dewey Phan closed his laptop, finished the last of a cup of coffee that had been refilled 4 times in the course of the evening, and picked up his phone to call his mother. She did not answer. It was past her bedtime. He left a voicemail, in Vietnamese. The voicemail said, "Mom, it's me. I am going to come by on Saturday. I love you. Good night." He put the phone down. He looked at the window. The street outside was quiet. There was no cruiser. There had not been a cruiser on this street since he had moved in. There was only the street light, and a dog 2 houses down, and a single car whose headlights were approaching from the end of the block and would, in approximately 40 seconds, pass under Dewey's window and continue on toward the intersection. Dewey watched the headlights. The car passed. It did not slow. It did not stop. It continued on. In the back seat of that car, which Dewey did not see, which he had no reason to see, which was not, in the paranoid imagination of a man who had spent a year learning to watch for cars, any particular car, a man in a dark jacket leaned forward toward the driver and said a single sentence that the driver nodded at and did not reply to. The man was not a Memphis police officer. The man was not a Precinct 19 officer. The man was not anyone who had been named in any document related to the pattern or practice case. The man was, however, the person to whom the redacted email from Commander Ives had been addressed 11 months earlier, on a spring morning that Commander Ives was spending in a house that was now held in his wife's name. The asset you identified has been cleared for field work. Proceed with site selection. H. The car turned left at the intersection and continued out of the neighborhood. Dewey, who had not seen the car, turned off the kitchen light and went to sleep. The work was not finished. It was not going to be finished. It was only going to be what the work always was, which was the next morning, and the morning after that, and the quiet and specific patience of people who had decided, for reasons their own, that the doors that did not open on their own were still worth the slow, grinding effort of learning how the doors worked underneath.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.